Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. My name is Jack. I've been a long-haul trucker for over 15 years now. My job is transporting everything from industrial machinery to fresh produce, anything you can imagine. For me, the highways of America are my office, and truck stops are my cafes. I love this lifestyle. No boss breathing down my neck, the scenery changing every day. And there's something deeply calming about driving through the night. Just me and the open road. But in this line of work, you learn that the highway has its traps. It's not just the risk of accidents or robberies. There are experiences that leave your mind restless for years afterward. I once lived through something that still makes me question everything I thought I knew. I don't know if it was bad luck or pure coincidence, but what happened that night changed me forever. It all started during one of those hauls nobody wants to take. Long, isolated routes through the forgotten corners of the Midwest. But they're part of the job. That night, I was transporting industrial tools to a small town near the Canadian border. The trip began smoothly. Straight roads, minimal traffic, and a completely clear autumn sky. I love driving at night because of the lighter traffic, and time flies when you've got good music playing. After about 5 hours on the road, my GPS indicated a detour, a secondary road poorly maintained, but supposedly a shortcut. Despite feeling an inexplicable uneasiness, I followed the directions. The road was so narrow, it seemed designed for compact cars, not 18-wheelers. The only sounds breaking the silence were my engine's rumble and the chirping of crickets in the fields beyond. As I drove, I spotted a car stopped on the shoulder, an old Buick sedan with its hazard lights blinking. There was nobody around. I figured the driver had left to seek help, but I wasn't about to stop and investigate. I kept going, but a few miles later, I saw another car, exactly the same model, with hazard lights flashing in the exact same pattern. I slowed down, suspicious. It was impossible for that vehicle to have passed me without my noticing. That unsettled me, but I decided to continue, thinking maybe fatigue was playing tricks on my mind. Further ahead, something even more disturbing. A semi-truck was parked in the middle of the road with no hazard lights and the cabin doors wide open. I slowed down but stayed inside my truck, alert. I'd heard stories about traps where abandoned vehicles are used to lure victims for robbery or worse. I switched to high beams to see better and noticed blood stains on the side of the cabin. The windshield was shattered from the inside out. My instincts screamed for me to get out of there, but curiosity pushed me to investigate. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight, stepped down, and approached cautiously. I looked around but saw no one. When I peered into the cabin, it was empty, no signs of struggle. Just the blood and that silence that made my chest tighten. I hurried back to my truck with my heart racing. As soon as I accelerated to leave, I saw lights in my rearview mirror. It was the same old Buick from before, now behind me. I thought it might be a coincidence, someone heading to the same destination. But the car didn't try to pass or fall behind. It maintained an exact distance. When I sped up, it did the same, and when I slowed down, so did it. I tried the CB radio to contact anyone in the area, but received only static. My cell phone showed no signal. Further ahead at a sharp curve, I came face to face with an improvised roadblock. Branches, rocks, and old traffic cones scattered across the road. I slammed on the brakes, and the car behind me did the same. Then 3 men got out, not 2 like I'd expected, one carrying a crowbar, another what looked like a gun, and the third stayed partially hidden behind the car door. My body flooded with adrenaline. I locked the truck doors and started weighing my options. Should I try to drive through the blockade, or stay put and try to handle this another way? While I hesitated, the men approached, shouting something I couldn't understand. Not knowing if it was courage or pure desperation, I floored the accelerator and launched my 18-wheeler at the roadblock. The impact was violent, but the vehicle plowed through the branches and rocks. In the rearview mirror, I saw the men running back to their car. They tried to follow, but the debris on the road slowed them down. I kept driving without looking back, heart pounding, with a constant sense of danger. I had no idea if they were gone for good, or if something worse waited ahead. Thankfully, the rest of the journey was uneventful, but the story was far from over. The next day at my destination, I inspected the damage to my truck caused by the impact. That's when I noticed something strange. A small box wrapped in black electrical tape hidden under the passenger seat. That wasn't mine, and I was certain it hadn't been there when I left. I opened it carefully, and what I saw nearly made me pass out. Bundles of cash, small packages of white powder, and a handwritten note that said, "We left this here in case you get any ideas." But below that, something else that wasn't in the original note. A crude map with 3 red X's marked along my planned return route. In that moment, everything made horrible sense. Those men weren't just pursuing me. They wanted to use my truck to transport something without my knowledge, or perhaps they had confused me with someone else. What was even more chilling, they knew exactly where I was headed and how I planned to get back. I didn't know exactly what they had in mind, and honestly, I preferred not to find out. I turned the package in to the local police, gave my statement, and took a completely different route home, staying on major highways and driving straight through with minimal stops. Since that night, I've thought a lot about what happened. Maybe it was pure luck that I made it out of that situation alive. Or maybe someone upstairs was looking out for me. All I know is that if things had gone differently, I might not be here to tell this story. The strangest part, 3 weeks later, I received an anonymous text message. "Smart move. Next time won't be practice." I changed my number the same day and started carrying protection in my truck. The highways may be my office, but I've learned they hide secrets darker than the night itself. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My name is Andrew, and I'm 40 years old now. But the story I want to share happened several years ago when I worked harvesting apples in the Hudson Valley region of New York. The fruit is produced on a large scale there. Part goes for export, and the rest is sold locally. My father had always been in this line of work, and I started helping him at an early age. The pay was good at first. They paid by the day. But over time, they switched to paying for each crate harvested. Honestly, it wasn't heavy work. It required effort, yes, but it was manageable. The orchards were nestled in the rolling hills, a few miles from the river. Many small producers cultivated in that area, men who planted on a smaller scale. My father and I preferred working for these small farmers because they offered better pay. Besides, they were almost always acquaintances of ours. What I'm about to tell you happened in one of these orchards. The plantation was modest, and the owner, Mr. Mitchell, was a close friend of my father's. They had worked together before, which is why he trusted us so much. That day, he was also helping with the harvest. I remember that on that occasion, we split up. I went to the far left corner, away from my father and Mr. Mitchell to start with the last trees. We used long wooden poles with nets at the end that allowed us to pick the apples without having to climb to the tops of the trees. However, I rarely used the pole, preferring to climb up onto the branches. I carried a makeshift backpack with me to collect the fruit while working. While I was focused on the work, standing on a branch close to the trunk, I noticed something from the corner of my eye. It was a quick movement, as if someone was walking by. I turned my head and saw a person. I thought it was my father, but to my surprise, it was a woman. From above, I couldn't see her face well, since she had long, dark hair. The way she walked caught my attention. She seemed to have difficulty moving. I observed her for a few moments. She bent down and picked up an apple from the ground, then raised her face, noticing that I was staring at her. Her face was strange. It looked like that of an older person, but there was something unusual about it. I can't describe it exactly, but her countenance seemed misaligned, as if one side was lower than the other. When she smiled, I saw her teeth. They were very yellowed, almost brown. She said something that I initially didn't understand. "Can I take this apple?" She repeated in an incredibly soft voice that didn't match her body. It sounded like the timbre of a child. For some reason, I felt uncomfortable and tense. After a few seconds, I replied that yes, she could take it. Without thanking me, she turned her back and continued walking, still smiling. I watched until she disappeared among the trees. I tried to return to work, but her presence disturbed me. I had never seen her before, and her figure was unfamiliar to me. I climbed down from the branch and went to my father. I shouted to get his attention. He turned to me with a questioning expression and asked what had happened. "There's a woman here in the orchard," I murmured, still somewhat uneasy. My father, confused, wanted to know what I was talking about. I explained that I had seen a woman near where I was working, and added that I had never seen her before in the area. He found it strange that someone would be walking around there, but suggested that perhaps she was accompanying one of the local farmers. We decided not to pay more attention to the matter and continued working. We spent 2 days in that orchard. There weren't many apples to harvest, but with just the 3 of us, the work progressed slowly. After the harvest, it was still necessary to inspect the fruit to ensure it had no blemishes, according to export requirements. On the 2nd day, late in the afternoon, the sun had almost disappeared. We were nearly finished, but the light was scarce. I was tired but wanted to finish quickly. When we loaded the last crates onto the pickup truck, I felt the need to go to the bathroom. While my father and Mr. Mitchell were talking, I took the opportunity to step away a bit to urinate. I went among the trees and walked a few yards. It was then that I noticed a shadow in the distance. The silhouette seemed familiar, and I could almost swear it was the same woman from the previous day. She was standing in the same position. Again, something about her troubled me, causing a fear difficult to explain. The woman seemed to be looking for something on the ground, squatting with her head down. A shiver ran through my body, so strong that I even lost the urge to urinate. It was as if a coldness traveled up my spine. Impulsively, I picked up a small stone from the ground and threw it in her direction. The first stone didn't hit anything, but on the third attempt, I noticed the woman raised her face, startled. I quickly hid so she wouldn't see me, then immediately ran back to the pickup truck where my father was. As soon as he saw me, he asked if something had happened. Since Mr. Mitchell was also nearby, I decided to tell them that I had seen the woman again. Mr. Mitchell was intrigued and asked who she was. I explained everything and said it was the second time I had seen her. He became irritated. "No one has permission to enter my orchard," he stated. Soon after, he went to take a walk around the property, but found nothing. I described the woman as best I could remember, but Mr. Mitchell said he had no idea who it might be. My father tried to calm him down, suggesting that perhaps she was someone from the area. "I think she's stealing my apples," said Mr. Mitchell, annoyed. At that time, it was common for people to invade orchards, to steal large quantities of fruit, and resell them in markets in other towns. Mr. Mitchell assured us he would take measures. I climbed into the back of the pickup, and we headed toward town. Later that same night, my father remembered that he had forgotten the harvesting pole in the orchard. He asked me to go get it, but there was a problem. It was already past 9 at night. Even by bicycle, it would take me about half an hour to get there. I replied that I would get the pole the next day, and fortunately, he didn't insist. The next day, I was busy helping my uncle with some chores, and ended up forgetting my father's request. Later, when I got home, he asked if I had picked up the pole. Somewhat reluctantly, I took the bicycle and headed toward the orchard. I didn't want to irritate him. The sun was already disappearing on the horizon. On the way, I passed some men unloading apples from a pickup truck. I continued to the property gate, took the key from my pocket, and unlocked the padlock. I leaned my bicycle against the fence and went to the place where my father mentioned he had left the pole. To my surprise, I found only a worn-out chair. The daylight was already giving its last breaths, and I decided to make a quick search before darkness took over. I walked among the trees around, but there was no sign of the pole. When I reached the edge of the property, still unsuccessful, I turned to return. Suddenly, I felt a blow to my arm. I let out a cry of pain. The impact was strong. At first, I thought it was a stone, but soon I noticed, a few yards away from me, a bitten apple on the ground. I looked up, confused, and saw a shadow behind a tree trunk. The figure raised its hand and threw another apple that hit my stomach. I tried to grab the fruit to throw it back, but the shadow advanced in my direction with impressive speed. Everything happened in an instant. I saw that it was the same woman from the previous days. wearing the same dirty outfit that dragged on the ground. She was running toward me. I quickly stepped backward. Her sudden movements and the dim light didn't let me clearly identify her face, but I soon realized it was that woman. I grabbed her thin arms, feeling the bones beneath the skin. A chill ran through my body. The smell coming from her was unbearable, a mixture of rotten meat and something burnt. Her breathing was heavy and noisy. I pushed her away forcefully, but she approached again. This time I could see her face better. A dark, viscous liquid was dripping from her mouth, thicker than saliva. She was emitting low sounds, like the growls of an angry animal. My heart raced and fear overtook me. It was like facing a rabid dog. "Ma'am, please calm down," I kept saying, but it seemed she couldn't hear me. Her eyes were empty, her body extremely thin. Each of my attempts to push her away was frustrated because she advanced with her mouth open, trying to bite me. I began to shout, hoping that the men I had seen on the way would hear me. I looked for something to defend myself with, but bending down to pick up a stone seemed too risky. With no alternatives, I kicked her legs. The sound of bones twisting was terrible. A hot, viscous liquid was dripping from her lips, staining my arms. Desperate, I grabbed her by the elbows and threw her against a tree. Her body seemed to have no weight. I took advantage of the moment to run. I felt a strange sensation on my back, as if she could reach me at any moment. I heard her growls and the dry noise of teeth snapping. I ran as fast as I could until I reached the main gate. With trembling hands, I struggled to hold the bicycle. Even at a distance, the woman continued attacking me with apples. I hurriedly got on the bicycle and pedaled away, screaming while fear made me lose my balance. I believed that at any moment she would catch up with me. Shortly afterward, I spotted some people by the side of the road. They were men who were also harvesting apples. They noticed my state and asked what had happened. With difficulty breathing, I told them a woman had attacked me. I looked back, but there was no sign of anyone. They asked me to describe her. I gave them the details, but to be honest, even to me, it seemed absurd. One of them gave a discreet laugh, while another gave me a look of disbelief. An older gentleman approached. He said he knew me and mentioned my father's name. I confirmed I was his son. He asked if I wanted a ride back to town because they were about to leave. I didn't hesitate to accept. I didn't want to risk going back alone with so little light. On the way, my eyes kept scanning the surroundings. My body trembled with cold and nervousness. As soon as we arrived and I got out of the truck, my mother came to meet me. The concern on her face was evident. She asked what had happened, and even though I was uncertain, I told her everything. I told her about that woman, the unbearable smell, the fragile bones I felt when I touched her. My body was still overwhelmed by the shock. Just remembering her shadow among the trees made me tense. Later, I talked with my father, but their reaction made it clear they didn't take my story seriously. My father even asked, "And the harvesting pole? Did you bring it? I had completely forgotten about it." He didn't insist, perhaps because he noticed the fear on my face. Before going to sleep, my mother came to my room and asked again if I was sure about what I had told her. In her eyes, I could see doubt. I reinforced that it was true, that I had nothing to gain by making up such a thing. For several nights, I had nightmares. I always dreamed that woman was spitting that dark liquid on me. It was so vivid that I seemed to feel the warmth of the liquid on my skin. I asked my father to talk to a friend of his to see if he could find out anything, but he changed the subject, saying the man was probably too busy to worry about that. I spent days in fear, unable to understand what had happened. Luckily, the situation didn't repeat itself. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. What intrigued me was that no one in town reported seeing anything similar. The community was small, and anything would spread quickly. But there were no similar stories or rumors about that woman. Even today, when I talk about this, I feel uncomfortable. A strange tension takes over me. I have so many questions. Who or what was that figure? And why was she in the middle of the orchard? The next summer, I returned to work in the orchards, but never again at Mr. Mitchell's property. I've heard stories from other workers about strange figures seen at dusk between the trees, but I've dismissed them as mere tales meant to scare newcomers. Still, on foggy autumn mornings, when the mist clings to the ground beneath the apple trees, I can't help but scan the orchard's edge, half expecting to see a hunched silhouette with long dark hair, waiting with a bruised apple in her bony hand. Sometimes I wonder if she's found someone else to terrorize, or if she's still there, waiting among the trees for someone foolish enough to work alone as the daylight fades. Perhaps there are things in this world that we aren't meant to understand, things that exist in the shadowy spaces between what we know and what we fear. But one thing I know for certain: I will never forget the sound of her teeth snapping together, or the dark, viscous liquid that dripped from her lips. And I will never again stay in an orchard past sunset. I want to share an unsettling experience I had during the wake of my friend's cousin in rural Vermont. It was late autumn of 1976, and the leaves had just begun to fall when my friend asked me to accompany him to the family farmhouse where the body was being kept for viewing. In my family, there's a deep-seated belief that holding wakes in one's home can tether the deceased's spirit to the physical world, and remarkably, that's precisely what seemed to happen. Only a few hours had passed since the wake began. Hushed conversations filled the old Victorian farmhouse with its creaking floorboards and drafty corridors. I found myself standing near the widower, who was looking after their daughter, a child of just 5 years old. Though she spoke with the typical hesitation of a child her age, what she said sent chills down my spine. "I want to go with Mommy," she said, her voice small but clear. "She's right there by the wooden box." The little girl repeated these words several times, insisting she could see her mother walking through the rooms of the house. I was deeply shaken, as I've always been a believer in supernatural phenomena. However, most of the mourners paid no attention to the child's claims, likely too consumed by their own grief to notice. After the funeral service at the local church, my friend revealed something even more disturbing that the widower had confided in him. During one of the nights when the body was still in the house, the man had heard his wife's voice coming from their daughter's bedroom, singing the lullaby she always used to help the little girl fall asleep. When he rushed to check, he found only his daughter sleeping peacefully in an otherwise empty room. He tried convincing himself it was merely his imagination playing cruel tricks. But the following morning, the child told him that her mother had been there all night, singing to help her sleep. The confused little girl kept pointing to specific corners of the house, where she claimed to see her mother standing, watching over them. The strange occurrences didn't cease after the burial in the snow-covered cemetery behind the town's church. Footsteps echoed through the hallway when no one was walking there. The deceased woman's personal items seemed to relocate themselves overnight. Most disturbingly, handprints began appearing on the frosted windows of their daughter's bedroom, too high up for the child to reach. The phenomena were most frequent in the daughter's room, as if the mother returned each night to watch over her child, seemingly unwilling to leave her daughter unprotected in this world. What struck me as particularly bizarre was that during the funeral procession, 6 pallbearers struggled with the weight of the casket, despite the deceased being a slight woman who couldn't have weighed more than 110 pounds. The men later described it as if they were carrying something 3 times its expected weight. Perhaps the most compelling incident involved a male carrier who was unaware of the woman's death. She arrived at the farmhouse 2 weeks after the funeral, and upon being informed by the widower about the tragic news, insisted that moments earlier she had seen the deceased woman peering through the front window and even waving at her from behind the curtains. What she witnessed appeared to be the spirit of the woman, still anchored to her home. For my family, this experience reinforced our conviction that wakes held in homes can cause spirits to remain tethered to the physical location, reluctant to move on to whatever lies beyond. The widower eventually moved with his daughter to a new home in the spring, unable to bear the constant reminders, both natural and supernatural, of his wife's presence. Yet even more unsettling was what happened in the following months. The new family that purchased the farmhouse began experiencing similar phenomena. They had no knowledge of the previous owner's death, yet their own young son began speaking of a nice lady who would come to his room at night and sing him songs when he was scared. When shown a photo album left behind in the attic, he immediately pointed to the deceased woman, identifying her as his nighttime visitor. Years later, I returned to that small Vermont town on business. Curiosity led me to drive by the old farmhouse, which had changed hands several times since then. As I slowed my car to look, I could have sworn I saw the silhouette of a woman standing in the upstairs window, her hand pressed against the glass as if reaching out. By the time I blinked, the figure was gone, but the impression of a small hand remained visible on the window, slowly fading as I watched. Some bonds, it seems, are too powerful to be broken even by death itself. Whether these experiences were genuine manifestations or merely the projection of collective grief, they've left an indelible mark on my understanding of what might exist beyond the veil between life and death. The Watchers by the Flames, my name is Xavier. I've worked as a long-haul trucker for over 20 years now, crisscrossing nearly every highway in America. I've always preferred driving at night. There's a certain peace to the empty roads, the gentle hum of tires on asphalt, and the lighter traffic that lets me make good time. But after what happened to me last autumn, I've started to see those deserted stretches of road differently. I don't usually talk about this with anyone, partly because I'm not sure if what I experienced was real, or just my mind playing tricks on me after too many hours behind the wheel. But I'll tell you anyway. It was a crisp October night with clear skies and a slight breeze, perfect driving weather. I was hauling a relatively light load of electronics through the Appalachian foothills, taking a less traveled route that wound through dense forests and isolated meadows. It wasn't the most scenic drive during daylight hours, but at night, with nothing but darkness beyond my headlights, one road looks much like another. I had a thermos of black coffee beside me, and some old blues playing on the radio. Everything was going smoothly. I'd made excellent time, pushing nearly 400 miles without a single traffic jam. That's when I noticed something unusual around a sharp bend in the road. There were fires burning in a clearing some distance from the highway, not an uncommon sight in rural areas. Sometimes it's local workers taking a break or people camping out. But what unsettled me was the strange symmetry of these fires. They were perfectly aligned in two parallel rows, each flame identical in size and intensity, burning with an unnatural steadiness that no ordinary campfire could maintain. I found it odd but kept driving, though the image of those perfectly aligned fires stayed with me. Just a few miles later, my truck started acting up. The engine made a sputtering noise like it was losing power, and the headlights flickered several times before returning to normal. I'm no mechanic, but I knew something wasn't right. Better to pull over and check things out than break down in the middle of nowhere. The road was completely deserted, not a single vehicle passing in either direction. I switched off the engine, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped out. The moment my boots hit the ground, the wind died completely. The crickets that had been chirping incessantly fell silent. The silence became so dense that my own footsteps seemed to echo as I walked around to check the engine. That's when I heard it, laughter in the distance, but not ordinary laughter. It was soft, almost whispered, like a collective murmur carried on the still air. I glanced back toward the fires and noticed they seemed closer now, though I couldn't understand how that was possible. I tried to focus on inspecting the truck, but found nothing obviously wrong, even though the engine had clearly been struggling. Then I felt it, that unmistakable sensation of being watched. I looked around and near the fires. I could make out what appeared to be human silhouettes, or something resembling humans. They stood motionless by the flames, seemingly staring in my direction. A chill ran up my spine, but I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just shadows playing tricks on my tired eyes. I climbed back into the cab, locked the doors, and tried to start the engine again. Nothing happened. The key turned, but the truck showed no signs of life. Suddenly, I heard a soft sound on the windshield, like something had touched it. When I looked, I saw what appeared to be a handprint made of ash. Without thinking too much about it, I got out again, determined to check everything and get away from there as quickly as possible. I went to the back to inspect the cargo, and while doing so, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but saw no one, just the empty road and that absolute silence. I looked once more toward the area where the fires were burning and noticed one of them slowly going out. Then another and another. The silence took over everything again. No more laughter or whispers in the air, just the sound of my racing heart and hurried footsteps. I jumped back into the truck, locked the door, and turned the key once more. The engine sputtered, but eventually started with effort. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, and that's when I saw something that made me accelerate without hesitation. The same figures that had been surrounding the fires were now lined up along the road, arranged in the same pattern as the flames had been. They were tall, unnaturally thin, and although their faces remained hidden in shadow, I had the unmistakable feeling they were looking directly at me. Without a second thought, I pressed the accelerator to the floor and left that stretch of road behind, carrying with me the impression that those presences were following me with their gaze. Only when I reached a more populated area with house lights and some people around did I feel relief. I stopped at a gas station to catch my breath and check the truck. Everything seemed normal, as if nothing unusual had happened. But when I approached the windshield, the ashy handprint was still there, untouched. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know if they were humans, shadows, or something even more disturbing. I only know that those motionless silhouettes in that desolate setting have been etched into my memory. Whatever they were, I hope I never cross paths with them again. The final visit, I never imagined experiencing something that defied logic or common sense. I always dismissed ghost stories as pure fiction. But even though I'm still not completely convinced, one particular episode made me question whether spirits might really exist among us. It happened on the day my father died. While my family gathered at the funeral home to say their goodbyes, I chose to stay home. I didn't want my last memory of him to be that way. I locked myself in his bedroom, overwhelmed with grief, clutching his pillow that still carried his scent. Exhaustion eventually took over, and I fell asleep right there. That's when something strange happened. I woke to his cologne, that familiar scent, filling the room as if someone had just applied it. I thought my mother or brother had returned home, but when I went looking for them, the house was completely empty. I went downstairs to the living room, lost in thoughts about my father, when I heard something coming from upstairs, footsteps. They were firm and unmistakable, the same sound his heavy work boots always made on our old floorboards. I stood frozen, watching the chandelier sway slightly with the vibrations from the steps. Then suddenly the sound stopped. Despite my fear, I decided to go upstairs. As I approached my parents' bedroom, I heard something even more familiar, the creaking of the rocking chair where he used to spend hours reading or just thinking. I slowly opened the door, and there was the chair rocking by itself as if someone was sitting in it, gently swaying back and forth for the last time. In that moment, I didn't feel fear, but an overwhelming sadness. I collapsed onto the bed and cried uncontrollably while the chair gradually slowed until it became completely still. Everything was closed, no wind, no draft, nothing that could explain what I had witnessed, except perhaps what I'd heard people say so many times. Maybe my father was there, taking his last steps in the home he loved. After all, it was his favorite chair. Was it really him? Or was my grief-stricken mind simply filling the void with something I needed to feel? I still don't know for sure. The false police my name is Matthias, and I've been a truck driver for many years. My daily life consists of crossing roads throughout the country, hauling everything from heavy equipment to everyday items. Let me tell you something. In this line of work, you learn quickly that danger isn't always found in potholes or treacherous curves. Sometimes what truly threatens you doesn't come from the road, but from what hides in the darkness. And I'm not talking about animals crossing the road. That would be easy. I'm talking about something much more frightening, that has no mercy when putting you in real trouble. I experienced this during a trip through rural Nevada, on a route that was largely unfamiliar to me. It was such an isolated stretch that it reminded me of driving through the void itself. Normally, I would avoid passing through there, but they sent me that way because it was supposedly faster and without the inconvenience of checkpoints and way stations. The problem was that the danger on that road was quite different from what I expected. The journey took place around 1 a.m, those hours when the highway is a frightening emptiness. No lights, houses, or any sign of life for miles. Everything was eerily calm until I spotted flashing red and blue lights in my rearview mirror. They seemed to be from a police vehicle. My instinct warned me that something was wrong, but I had no reason not to stop. Everything was in order with my cargo. I slowed down and pulled over onto the shoulder. A white pickup truck parked behind me. It had flashing lights, but looking closer, it didn't seem to be an official vehicle. Still, I thought that in that region, police sometimes use unmarked cars. The driver got out, a man wearing a generic uniform, dark pants, boots, and a shirt with a symbol I couldn't identify. He wore a cap and carried a weapon on his belt. He approached and with a firm tone said, "Good evening, friend. We're conducting inspections on trucks. We need to check your cargo. There are reports of smuggling in this area." His voice was authoritative, as if he was accustomed to giving orders, but something bothered me. The uniform had no official insignia, no emblem, no identification with his name as is common. Moreover, the weapon he carried wasn't standard issue. It looked more like an assault rifle. I tried to explain that my cargo was legal, just replacement parts for auto repair shops. But he insisted, saying that if I didn't open the trailer, he would have to take me to a checkpoint for a complete inspection. While he was talking, I noticed in the rearview mirror that another man had gotten out of the pickup, carrying a flashlight, and went directly to the trailer. It was then that I noticed something that put me even more on alert. A third person was crouched behind the truck, as if checking the tires or looking for something underneath the vehicle. "What are they doing?" I asked, trying not to show my nervousness. He looked at me calmly, but didn't answer, only repeating that I should open the trailer. It was at that moment that it clicked. This wasn't a police stop. They were setting something up, and it certainly wasn't an honest inspection. I can't say if it was instinct or pure reflex from fear, but I decided right then that I wouldn't stay there to find out what worse thing could happen. I locked the doors, put the truck in gear, and prepared to get out of there as fast as possible. The man started shouting, ordering me to turn off the engine, but I simply ignored him. I fixed my gaze ahead and noticed there was a barrier with cones and a long board. I thought that running over it might damage the truck, but staying put seemed much more dangerous. I accelerated without hesitation, and the truck advanced, dragging the cones and the board along the way. I heard banging on the cab, probably from the guy who was near the window, but I didn't slow down. In the rearview mirror, I saw the two men rushing toward the pickup truck. At this point, my body was operating in pure survival mode. A few minutes later, red and blue flashing lights appeared again. This time I had no doubts. They were after me. They weren't police, but criminals using tricks to create an ambush. My heart felt like it was going to burst from my chest, but giving up wasn't an option. Fortunately, the road was very narrow, making it difficult for them to overtake me. Even so, every time I looked in the rearview mirror, there they were, trying to close the distance. What lasted about 20 minutes seemed like an eternity. Then finally, I saw something that brought me some relief. A real checkpoint, official vehicles, and bright lights illuminating the road. I slowed down and stopped the truck near the officers. When I lowered the window, I quickly told them what had happened, pointing to the pickup that was just behind. The agents didn't waste time. They set up a barrier to intercept them. To my surprise, however, the pickup never appeared. They probably found some detour and disappeared into the darkness without me noticing. The police inspected the truck and confirmed that everything was in order. They explained to me that the region was notorious for criminals who posed as authorities, using fake vehicles and uniforms to deceive truck drivers, steal cargo, or even commit kidnappings. They said I was very lucky to act quickly, because many others don't have the same chance to escape. Since that day, I've become extremely cautious. Now I only stop if I'm absolutely certain that whoever is ordering me to pull over truly represents the law. I've become paranoid, always with the feeling that I'm being followed. Every time I see a patrol car, whether in the city or on the highway, I go into a state of alert. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't trusted my instincts that night. One thing is certain, not every threat on the road comes from what's in front of you. Sometimes the real danger is what appears in your rearview mirror, wearing a uniform that doesn't belong to it. Sometimes life pushes us toward choices we never thought we'd make, choices that end up defining who we become. This is my story, one of those moments that changed everything, filled with courage, doubts, and discoveries. My name is Michael. I want to share a brief but troubling experience that left me unsettled for many years. In the winter of 2013, I faced serious difficulties with my family that pushed me to make a radical decision. I had just turned 21, and with the situation at home becoming unbearable, I decided to move out. Fortunately, I had been working since I was 17 and had managed to save a decent amount of money. It wasn't a fortune by any means, but it was enough for emergencies. With my savings and the job I managed to keep, I relocated to a neighborhood in Boston near Haymarket Station. Without references or any knowledge about the quality of the area, I rented a place the very same day. It was either that or spending the night on the street or in a hotel, something I wanted to avoid at all costs. The elderly woman who owned the properties was extraordinarily kind. Moved by my situation, she offered me one of 4 small houses on her property, 2 located at the back and 2 near the entrance, with a central courtyard between them. The exhaustion of that day prevented me from noticing anything strange. I simply arranged the essentials, settled in, and fell asleep in the simple but welcoming little house. The first night passed quietly, but on the second night, something caught my attention. I returned from work after dark, prepared for bed, and while lying down, heard a sound coming from the bathroom about 12 feet from my bed. It sounded like someone was opening and closing the doors of the medicine cabinet above the sink. The creaking sound was distinct, and it seemed as if someone was rummaging through the few things I had there: mouthwash, a box of baking soda, nothing more than that. After a few moments, the noise stopped with the closing of the cabinet doors. Fear overtook me. My first thought was that someone had broken in, but I quickly realized that was impossible. I had been in the bathroom minutes before, and there was no sign of entry. I got up, walked over there calling out loudly to see if anyone was there. No response. When I opened the door, everything was exactly as I had left it. The cabinet closed, objects in order. Though confused, I tried to convince myself I had imagined the sound. But the noise had been so clear. The following night, the same thing happened, the same sound, the creaking of the cabinet door, objects being moved around, and then the closing. I got up once more and found everything undisturbed. The repetition left me anxious, but I eventually fell asleep after convincing myself that the noise might be coming from the neighbor through the small bathroom window. It was this thought that calmed me enough not to succumb to fear that night. The next morning, as I left the house, I decided to examine the surroundings. My intention was to check if my bathroom window could somehow be connected to my neighbor's. However, since my house was at the back right corner, I realized this was impossible. The window faced directly onto the wall, separating the property from a vacant lot next door. That same day, I called the landlady from work. I felt a mixture of embarrassment and fear, of seeming ungrateful, since she had been so welcoming when I needed it most. Fortunately, she didn't take my call as a complaint. That's when she told me something unexpected. "Young man, it breaks my heart to hear this," she said in her gentle New England accent. "But you're actually the fifth person to tell me something strange happens in that house. There was a tenant who lived there for about 14 months, but she never mentioned anything. I hope nothing happened to her. When I offered you the house, I thought these things had stopped a long time ago. But don't worry, if you want, you can move to the front house today. It's vacant and identical. I'll figure out what to do with that house later." I accepted the exchange immediately, and after that, everything was peaceful. Several months later, I found a place closer to work and moved out for good. Before leaving, I asked the landlady about those occurrences. She told me she never knew their origin, but several former residents had reported similar things, sounds that seemed to indicate someone else was in the house. Sometimes they heard noises in the kitchen, other times in the living room, and in my case, in the bathroom. The property still exists today. It was renovated a few years ago and looks quite nice now. But I don't know if what I experienced continues to happen there. Some people say it's something called residual hauntings, a kind of energy imprint. They would be like traces of routines that someone performed there long ago, possibly from a resident who is no longer in this world. Perhaps this occurred even before the place was transformed into a residential property. What troubled me most wasn't just the sounds themselves, but what I discovered a year later. I ran into the landlady at a local market, and she mentioned casually that they had done renovations on my old unit. "You wouldn't believe what we found," she said. when they tore out that old medicine cabinet in the bathroom. There was a small diary wedged behind it in the wall. Belonged to a young woman who lived there in the 1970s. The last entry just said, "Someone's been going through my things at night. I can hear them opening my cabinet when I'm in bed." I never returned to that neighborhood again, and to this day, I still check my medicine cabinet twice before going to bed. It was during my second year at the Academy of Digital Arts in Seattle when I first became curious about what they called the dark web. The topic emerged during a digital ethics module when Professor Levine, a former cybersecurity specialist with piercing eyes that seemed to hold secrets of their own, introduced it almost casually as a kind of secret dimension of the internet, something shrouded in mystery and widely misunderstood. From that moment, I was captivated. I immersed myself in research, reading articles and watching videos, some alarmist, others more technical, fascinated by the idea of a hidden network beneath the surface of the common web. I won't deny that the obscure side awakened a certain curiosity in me, but my primary interest lay in the technological aspects, the structure behind it all, and the implications it might have for the future of the internet. Discovering how to access the dark web proved simpler than I had imagined. I started by downloading the Tor browser, designed to ensure anonymity by redirecting data through different servers operated by volunteers. For extra precaution, I used a VPN to add another layer of protection. Navigating this network, however, was quite different from what we're accustomed to with tools like Google, where everything is organized and easy to search. On the dark web, you depend on directories like the Hidden Wiki to find onion addresses, or forums where more experienced users share tips. Only after studying extensively and feeling secure did I begin to explore on my own. The first things I found left me both intrigued and disconcerted. There were resources focused on digital privacy, such as guides for using encrypted messaging applications and secure means to avoid surveillance. Despite its bad reputation, I realized that many of these materials were used by journalists or activists living under repressive governments, a legitimate use I hadn't considered before. I also encountered ordinary people who simply prioritized their digital privacy, which made perfect sense to me. However, it didn't take long before I stumbled upon more disturbing aspects. Some users held troubling beliefs, like those who claimed to be victims of gangstalking. This term refers to the idea that someone is being targeted by orchestrated persecution from an organized group that supposedly conducts surveillance, public intimidation, and even acts of sabotage. Although isolated cases of coordinated harassment exist, most accounts lack concrete evidence and are frequently linked to paranoia, anxiety, or other psychiatric disorders. The intensity of these beliefs causes many to interpret ordinary situations as deliberate threats, creating devastating impacts on their personal and family relationships. What I observed in the gangstalking forum was simultaneously desolating and disturbing. Many people's lives had completely collapsed, and instead of seeking support from loved ones, they isolated themselves, created closed communities on the internet, and mutually reinforced their distorted beliefs. In some cases, this seemed to lead to tragic outcomes. What began for me as academic curiosity quickly transformed into a deeper reflection on privacy, surveillance, and how technology influences our freedoms. I realized that the dark web itself was neither good nor bad. It was merely a tool whose morality depended on the purpose of those who used it. As I delved deeper, however, it became inevitable to cross paths with the darker side of this universe. It was a gradual process, like removing layer after layer of something you're not sure you really want to face. I found references to markets where illegal items were traded, and forums where unethical or clearly criminal practices were discussed without euphemisms. I wasn't looking for this kind of content, but it appeared spontaneously amidst seemingly harmless material. Among the most disturbing stories were rumors about so-called red rooms. It was said that these spaces broadcast unimaginable events live to spectators willing to pay in cryptocurrencies. Some dismissed these stories as exaggerated myths or completely fictional tales created to perpetuate the mystery of the dark web. Others, however, reported frighteningly specific details, such as hidden links and exorbitant prices charged to access these broadcasts. Although I never found any concrete proof of the existence of these rooms, the idea alone was disturbing. What struck me most in the obscure corners of the dark web was the casual manner in which some users discussed morally repugnant subjects as if they were trivial topics or mundane curiosities. It seemed that in this space, social rules had disappeared, and anonymity gave rise to anything, no matter how abominable, to flourish. Still, I made an effort to remember what had brought me there, to understand, not to participate. I avoided clicking on dubious links and stayed away from areas that were clearly not meant for me. But it was impossible to ignore the weight of what the dark web represented. For every secure communication service or activism forum, there was a dark side lurking in the shadows. The rumors about these red rooms continued to intrigue me. As I explored further, they emerged in forum discussions and chats, but always vaguely, without confirmation. Initially, I dismissed them as mere urban legends, products of fertile imaginations. However, as I read more accounts, the feeling that there might be something real behind those stories began to grow. It was a disturbing puzzle, and I wasn't sure if I really wanted to solve it. But still, I couldn't avoid the desire to try to discover the truth. My investigation began on forums, where participants claimed to have exclusive information. The messages were enigmatic, filled with coded phrases and ambiguous references. Some described red rooms as paid live broadcasts, where atrocities were committed under the lens of a camera, often at the request of spectators. Others claimed this was impossible, citing technical limitations for making anonymous streams on Tor. Nevertheless, certain accounts brought such specific details that made me wonder if some dark corner of the internet hadn't actually made this viable. I followed these clues with extreme caution, navigating among forums, private chats, and obscure directories. The deeper I went, the more the environment seemed to transform, heavy, loaded with a disquiet difficult to ignore. I encountered sinister-looking sites, simple black and white pages full of suspicious links. Some required credentials or cryptocurrency payments to proceed. I hesitated. I didn't want to cross a point of no return, but the need to know, to understand, propelled me forward. Were those links merely false shortcuts, or the entrance to something real? The most distressing moments arose when finding accounts from people who claimed to have participated in these broadcasts. They spoke of invitations sent through encrypted means, exorbitant prices paid in Bitcoin, and brief access to streams hosted on obscure servers. It all seemed like something out of a nightmare, but the richness of details made it disturbingly believable. I never found concrete evidence, no functional link, no solid proof, but the act of searching itself was suffocating. Each click brought the risk of stumbling upon something horrible, or crossing a moral barrier I didn't want to cross. In the end, I realized that the existence or non-existence of red rooms hardly mattered. The search for them had already shown me something deeply disturbing: the human capacity to imagine the worst. I turned off the computer with a heavy heart, relieved not to have found what I was looking for. The rumors remained rumors, but the obscurity I perceived along the way seemed as real as any evidence. Still, the sensation of being so close to something unknown drew me back. I clearly remember the moment when I finally found what I was looking for. It was the climax of weeks collecting diffuse clues, tracking rumors, and connecting fragments of an enigma that I wasn't sure I really wanted to unravel. It all happened suddenly, after hours navigating between dark forums and inactive links. A new post appeared in one of the most obscure places on the network, written by someone who swore to have access to a genuine red room. The message was short, a vague description, an encrypted link, and the requirement for payment in Bitcoin. My hesitation was instantaneous. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to stop, close everything, and never return. But the curiosity that had brought me there held me captive. I sent the requested amount, a sum that left me nauseated as I watched it disappear from my digital wallet, and followed the instructions. The link led me to a completely white page where there was only a countdown timer. It seemed surreal, as if I had entered a horror movie script. I waited with my heart racing, and an avalanche of doubts about every choice that had led me to that point. When the timer reached 0, the screen flickered, and a grainy video began to play. The scene was cold and clinical, illuminated by intense fluorescent lights that cast harsh shadows on the walls. In the center, a man in a white lab coat moved among improvised equipment, medical monitors, metal tables, and tools whose purpose I didn't even want to imagine. The camera slowly panned, revealing a person tied to one of the tables. They were awake, but the terror on their face was evident despite the poor audio quality and the gag that silenced them. Their muffled screams could be heard. Next to the video, a chat panel filled with real-time messages. Anonymous users typed requests to the host, some encouraging him to continue, others suggesting specific acts or experiments. What frightened me most wasn't just what I was seeing, but how the audience reacted. It seemed like a spectacle, an attraction to be consumed, while the tied person was treated as if they weren't human. I don't know if they believed it was all staged, but to me, it seemed brutally real. The procedures began, and I could barely watch. The man used injections, electric currents, and other devices that seemed designed to test pain thresholds and bodily reactions. The victim writhed and let out screams of despair, while the eager audience reacted with enthusiasm. Each request was more abominable than the last. What I saw wasn't just violence. It was a demonstration of cruelty without masks, coated with a pseudoscientific veneer that made everything even more disturbing. I can't say how long I remained watching. When I finally forced myself to close the browser, it was as if something inside me had broken. I slammed the laptop shut and sat there, feeling an overwhelming emptiness. A mixture of guilt and disgust took hold of me. That which had previously seemed an impossible story now revealed itself to be real, and much worse than any rumor or myth. That night, I deleted everything, removed the Tor browser, erased my Bitcoin wallet, and cleaned all traces of my searches. I wanted no connection to that horrible world I had accessed. However, the images remained in my mind. They became fixed like scars impossible to erase, and I think I'll carry this with me for the rest of my life. Months later, I was still haunted by what I'd witnessed. I started having recurring nightmares where I was the one strapped to that cold metal table, the faceless audience deciding my fate. I couldn't focus on my studies anymore. My roommate, Elijah, noticed my withdrawal and the dark circles under my eyes, but attributed it to typical academic stress. One evening in late autumn, while scrolling through a cybersecurity news site, I froze. There was a headline about an international police operation that had shut down a network of streaming sites operating on the dark web. The article mentioned extreme content without going into specifics, but included that several arrests had been made across Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia. A photo showed evidence being collected. Among the items was a metal table and medical equipment that looked hauntingly familiar. I felt a strange mixture of relief and renewed terror. Was it possible they had found the very site I had accessed? Had others reported it? Or had they simply been tracking these operations all along? The article mentioned that investigators had managed to identify some viewers through cryptocurrency transactions. My heart pounded against my chest. I had used Bitcoin. For weeks, I jumped at every notification on my phone, every knock at the door. I began taking circuitous routes back from campus, convinced I was being followed. Elijah started asking questions I couldn't answer. Then, 3 months after the article, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was blank, and the body contained only a string of seemingly random characters, except I recognized the format. It was an onion address. My hands trembled as I debated what to do. Something told me I needed to know what was on the other side of that link, even as every rational part of my brain screamed against it. I set up all my security protocols again and entered the address. The page loaded slowly, revealing nothing but white text on a black background. Viewer 347. We haven't forgotten you. The show must go on. Below was another countdown timer. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, then made my decision. I formatted my hard drive, packed only what I could carry, and left Seattle that night. I haven't used a computer since. Some nights I still wake up in cold sweat, wondering if they're still looking for me, or worse, if they've found someone else to take my place in the audience. The dark web wasn't just a technological curiosity or an academic interest. It was a door, and once you've seen what's on the other side, you can never truly close it again. My name is Joshua, and to this day, I don't know exactly what compelled me to accept that journey. Perhaps it was an escape from routine, or the need to challenge myself by facing my fears. What I know for certain is that I could never have imagined how much that expedition would transform my life. It was during the autumn of 2013 that my friends and I decided to explore the dense forests surrounding Mount Blackwood, located in northern Oregon, near the small town of Pinecrest in the Cascade Range. We were looking for something different, an experience that would disconnect us from the bustle of city life and immerse us in the vastness of nature. Our group consisted of 5 people: myself, Ethan, who naturally assumed the role of leader; Valerie, always with her camera ready to capture every moment; Claire, our expert in maps and directions; and Lucas, whose enthusiasm seemed more connected to the whiskey in his backpack than to the journey itself. The forest welcomed us with a silent majesty, trees so tall and ancient they seemed to touch the sky, while the crisp air carried the scent of pine resin mixed with damp soil. It was the perfect setting for the adventure we so desired. When we arrived at the small village that was the starting point of our excursion, we stopped at a general store to buy what we needed. It was there that we met Ezekiel, an old man with a gaze as deep as the shadows between the trees. While we settled our bill, he observed us with an expression that mixed curiosity and a certain uneasiness. "Where are you headed?" he asked, crossing his arms. "We're exploring the forests near Mount Blackwood," Ethan replied enthusiastically. "Our goal is to find the oldest trees." Ezekiel slowly shook his head, letting out a long sigh. "You shouldn't go so far. There are places in the forest that aren't meant for you. Listen to my advice, stay on the marked trails." Valerie, always skeptical, gave a short laugh. "And what could happen if we stray a little?" "We'll get lost." "Getting lost would be the least of your problems, young lady. What lies beyond the boundaries doesn't forgive those who challenge it." The old man's serious tone silenced even Lucas, who was normally immune to any warning. Ezekiel leaned in closer, almost whispering, "The forest has a guardian. It's not human nor beast. It's something you shouldn't see, because if you do, you'll never be the same." Ethan just smiled, full of self-confidence. "Don't worry, Ezekiel. We know how to handle ourselves." The old man shook his head resignedly and gave us one last warning. "If you encounter something strange, don't run, don't scream, and above all, avoid looking it in the eyes. It doesn't accept being challenged." The next day, completely ignoring Ezekiel's words, we began our hike. At first, everything seemed peaceful, and the forest welcomed us almost like an enchanted refuge. Valerie clicked her camera constantly, while Claire guided us confidently along the routes indicated on the map. "See, there's nothing to worry about," said Ethan, opening his arms with a confident smile. "It's just a forest." However, as we advanced, the trail markers began to disappear. Claire looked at the map repeatedly, confused. "This doesn't make sense. We should have found a clearing, but there's nothing here." "Maybe it's further ahead," suggested Lucas, opening a flask of whiskey with disinterest. Shortly after, we came across an old wooden sign driven into the ground. It was weathered by time and covered with moss, but it was still possible to read. "Do not continue dangerous terrain." Ethan, fearless as always, didn't even hesitate. "We're not stopping here just because of an old sign." Let's keep going. After we passed that sign, the scenery around us began to transform in an unsettling way. The air seemed to have gotten colder, and the silence that settled was almost oppressive. There was no longer the distant sound of birds or the crackling of branches under our feet. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. Have you noticed how quiet everything has become? Valerie asked, her eyes moving rapidly as she analyzed our surroundings. I nodded, but preferred not to say anything. There was something strange there, something that made each step heavier. Claire, who was normally the calmest in the group, began to show signs of discomfort. This is wrong. We shouldn't be here. Ethan, however, refused to stop. He argued that we needed to go further, that something incredible certainly awaited us ahead. Something incredible like what? Retorted Valerie, irritated. A sign congratulating us for being stubborn idiots. Before Ethan could respond, a strange sound took over the environment. It was deep, continuous, coming from all directions at once. We immediately froze, trying to identify where it was coming from. What was that? Mumbled Lucas, visibly frightened, something unusual for him. Nobody said anything. We remained still, barely breathing. The sound, which seemed to be distant at first, grew closer, and then we saw it. At first, I thought it was just a fallen log. But when that thing moved, I understood there was nothing ordinary about it. It was a creature of grotesque appearance, short, with a twisted body and features that defied any logic. Its face was a disturbing mix of human and animal traits, but what really froze us were the eyes, small, deep, and filled with silent rage. It moved among the shadows, watching us as if calculating its next step. "That's the guardian," whispered Valerie, without averting her gaze. "Don't move," ordered Ethan in an almost inaudible tone. The creature stared at us for a moment that seemed endless. Then suddenly, it let out a deafening scream, a sound that seemed to tear the very air around us. It was Lucas who broke the silence. He screamed and ran uncontrollably between the trees. The creature followed him with absurd agility for something so deformed. "Lucas," shouted Claire, trying to run after him, but Ethan grabbed her by the arm. "No, we can't go after him. We need to get out of here now." Without thinking, the four of us ran in the opposite direction. We no longer saw the creature, but its scream continued to echo through the forest. My heart seemed about to explode from how fast it was beating. The forest that had once welcomed us with serenity had now transformed into a frightening labyrinth. We ran without any direction, desperate to find our way back. But it seemed the forest was conspiring against us. The trees all looked the same, and the paths that previously seemed so obvious had disappeared, covered by branches and leaves that weren't there before. "We're never going to get out of here," cried Valerie, her face wet with tears. "Shut up," Ethan retorted firmly. "We will get out. Just keep running." However, something inside me said we weren't alone. I felt that something was following us, something that fed on the fear overflowing from each of us. We ran without direction, each carrying the hope of finding the way back to the village, or at least some place that would give us a sense of security. That forest, which initially seemed like a calm and enchanting refuge, now revealed itself as a relentless enemy. The trees seemed to grow with each moment, their tops blocking the light, and their shadows projecting forms that seemed to observe us and move in our direction. My mind couldn't escape a single thought. What had happened to Lucas? Was he alive? Had the creature caught up to him? The guardian's shrill cry seemed to echo endlessly in my head, accompanying each step I took. Ethan led our escape, but what was once confidence had given way to pure desperation. "Keep going," he shouted, even without showing signs of knowing where we were headed. Claire, who was normally the logical balance of the group, was right behind me, breathless and visibly shaken. Valerie remained silent, teary-eyed, her camera swinging inertly around her neck, completely forgotten. The daylight was disappearing, bringing with it a cold that seemed to penetrate to the bone. We made a brief stop to catch our breath. Ethan opened the map, but it was obvious that it would be of no use to us there. The trails had vanished, as if they had never existed. "What are we going to do?" I asked, trying to sound calmer than I actually was. "We just need to find the main path," Ethan responded, but even he seemed not to believe his own words. It was at that moment that we heard footsteps. At first they were soft, almost imperceptible, but soon they grew louder, heavier. We immediately stopped, our eyes moving in all directions. "Lucas," Valerie murmured, divided between hope and terror. The footsteps ceased, but the silence that followed was broken by the same guttural sound as before, deep and disturbing, as if coming from the bowels of the earth. "It's not Lucas," whispered Claire, gripping my arm tightly. Without saying anything, we began to move away from that sound, trying to walk quickly without raising an alarm. However, it seemed that the guardian was not willing to let us leave. As we crossed a dense group of trees, we reached a clearing. The space was strange, open, surrounded by immense trees, and in the center was a circle of stones arranged with almost surgical precision. The soil inside the circle was burned, as if something had recently been set on fire there. Claire took a step back, pale. "This isn't natural. This place was used for some kind of ritual." Ethan, still clinging to logic, tried to downplay it. "It's just a campfire. Some group of hunters must have passed through here." "Don't be an idiot," Valerie shot back angrily. "Look at the stones." I approached carefully and saw what she was talking about. Engraved on the stones were strange symbols, representations of something that seemed vaguely human, but distorted, almost monstrous. Looking at them caused me profound discomfort. Suddenly, Claire fell to her knees, holding her head as if she were in unbearable pain. "What's wrong?" I asked, kneeling beside her. Her voice came out weak, almost like a whisper. Valerie raised her camera and focused on the clearing. When she looked through the viewfinder, her face went pale. "There's something here. We can't see it with the naked eye, but it's here." At that moment, the air around us began to vibrate. A low, constant hum took over the clearing, as if the very forest was pulsating. The shadows of the trees lengthened, moving abnormally toward the circle of stones. Then we saw it again. It was even more terrible than before. Its twisted limbs seemed to stretch in an unnatural way, and its dark skin resembled burned bark. Despite its awkward gait, its movements were quick, as if defying the logic of what was possible. And those eyes, small, bright, full of an intensity that seemed to pierce the soul. Ethan raised his hand, trying to maintain calm. "Stay quiet. Don't provoke it." The guardian didn't need provocation. It advanced a step, emitting a deep grunt that seemed to go through our bones. It was then that I noticed something strange. The inscriptions on the stones began to emit a faint glow, as if its presence had awakened them. "This isn't just a guardian. It's part of some pact," I murmured, as the villager's words finally made sense to me. Claire raised her face, the pale contrast of her expression reinforcing the terror that surrounded us. "It's because of the illegal crops. They did this to protect them. The villagers made a deal with." The creature advanced again, and the strange hum that filled the air instinctively made me take a step back. I stumbled on one of the stones and fell. The movement attracted the guardian's attention, which let out a high-pitched scream, a sound that seemed to carry anger and warning. The clearing plunged into chaos. Ethan shouted and disappeared among the trees, his footsteps becoming echoes that soon faded away. Valerie ran after him, desperately calling his name, while Claire and I remained motionless, frozen by panic. The guardian didn't go after them. It turned to us, its eyes radiating a hatred that seemed almost physical. "It won't let us go," Claire whispered, squeezing my arm so hard it almost hurt. Without thinking, I took an impulsive action. "We don't want trouble. We're leaving," I shouted, my voice louder and firmer than I expected. For an instant, it stopped. It seemed to evaluate my words, but soon resumed advancing, emitting a low growl that made it clear our intentions didn't matter. With no other way out, I grabbed Claire's hand, and we ran into the forest. We could hear the guardian's footsteps behind us, each impact on the ground like thunder. I didn't know how long we could continue, but we couldn't stop. Then finally, we saw a light between the trees. It was a natural clearing, a glimpse of an exit. We ran toward that light with all our strength, with the last drop of energy we had. When we crossed the tree line, everything changed. The hum ceased, the air became lighter, and the forest sounds returned, as if the guardian couldn't cross that boundary. I collapsed on the ground, breathless, feeling my body tremble with exhaustion and fear. Shortly after, Valerie emerged from between the trees. She was alive, but the paleness on her face said it all. "And Ethan?" I asked, my heart racing, already fearing the answer. She slowly shook her head, unable to say anything. We sat there at the forest's edge, trying to catch our breath. But Ethan's absence was an unbearable weight. Valerie, with tears rolling down her face, hugged her own knees and repeatedly murmured, "I shouldn't have gone. I shouldn't have left him behind." Claire, still in shock, tried to maintain rationality. "We need to go back to the village and ask for help. Staying here condemns us." I knew she was right, but something in me refused to accept that Ethan was lost. His image was engraved in my mind, the exact moment when he stumbled and disappeared. "We can't abandon him. We don't even know what happened to Lucas," I said, my voice trembling more than I would have liked. Claire looked at me directly, her expression cold and serious. "If we go back now, the guardian will catch us." Ethan and Lucas knew what they were getting into. The words were harsh but true. The walk back to the village was torturous. Nobody said anything, each step seeming heavier than the last. The forest that before had seemed a sanctuary of beauty was now oppressive, full of shadows that seemed to move. Every sound, every breaking branch made us look back, expecting to see the guardian following us. When we arrived at the village, It seemed deserted. The few people who passed by us averted their gaze or stared at us with suspicion, as if they already knew what we had done. It was Ezekiel who received us, standing in front of his small store. His expression was somber, without any surprise. "I warned you," he said with an almost cruel calm. "I told you not to go beyond the boundaries. Ethan and Lucas are still there. We need to find them," Valerie implored, tears already streaming down. Ezekiel slowly shook his head, his response being a harsh blow to our hope. "If they stayed behind, there's nothing more you can do. Those who break the rules don't come back. The Guardian ensures that, but they're people, humans," I shouted, desperation overflowing in my voice. The old man sighed deeply, pointing to the horizon where the dense, dark forest rose like a living wall. "That place doesn't belong to the living. You crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed. Now all that's left is to accept the consequences." That night, Ezekiel allowed us to stay in his store. Although we were exhausted, none of us managed to truly rest. Later, as silence took over, I sat beside him in search of answers. "What is this Guardian?" I asked in a low voice, as if the very act of questioning was dangerous. He remained silent for a long moment before responding. "It's not something easy to explain. We call it the ambient, a creature that should never have existed. According to the ancients, it's a punishment from the earth itself, an aberration created to protect what is sacred." "Sacred?" I retorted with bitterness. "What can be sacred about protecting illegal crops?" Ezekiel's gaze hardened, but not with anger. For the first time, I noticed a mixture of shame and resignation. He knew we had discovered the hidden plantations. "The forest wasn't always like this," he began, his voice loaded with something close to remorse. "Before all this, before the plantations, these lands were sacred to our ancestors. But fear and greed led us to make a pact with something we don't understand. The ambient protects the lands, but not for us. It guards what remains of the past, and whoever defies it pays the price." At dawn, the tension in the air was palpable. Valerie, restless, could no longer bear it. "I'm going back to look for Ethan, with or without you," she announced as she organized her gear. "That's suicide," Claire exclaimed, suddenly rising. "If you go back, you'll end up like them." "I'd rather disappear trying than live knowing I did nothing," Valerie responded with a hard, determined look. I knew she wouldn't change her mind, and guilt was eating me up inside. I couldn't let her go alone. Despite the fear screaming inside me, I decided to accompany her. Claire, on the other hand, stayed in the village, too scared to risk it. When we entered the forest again, we were greeted by something even more frightening. The air seemed heavier, the tree shadows denser, and the silence was almost unbearable. We walked for hours, following what we thought was the previous path, but the forest seemed to have changed. Each step made us feel that it was deceiving us, taking us even further from any exit. After much wandering, we found the clearing. The circle of stones was there, but something had changed. The marks engraved on the stones glowed intensely, as if they were alive. In the center of the circle, we saw a figure. It was Ethan. His body was there, but he was no longer the same Ethan we knew. He remained motionless, eyes open and fixed, completely empty. His face had no expression, as if all his essence had been drained by the forest, leaving only a lifeless shell. Valerie collapsed on her knees, overcome by tears that wouldn't stop falling. I stood there, unable to move a muscle. Then we saw it. The guardian was at the edge of the clearing, watching us. Its deformed silhouette and eyes that seemed to burn in flames were even more terrifying under the opaque glow emanating from the stone circle. It remained motionless, but its presence seemed to suffocate everything around us. "Let's get out of here," I murmured, extending my hand to help Valerie rise. "There's nothing more we can do for him." She resisted, reluctant, but eventually gave in. We began to back away slowly, never averting our gaze from that creature. When we reached the edge of the clearing, the guardian leaned slightly in our direction, a movement more full of threat than anything else. It was as if it was telling us there wouldn't be a second chance. Upon returning to the village, Claire was already waiting for us. One look at our faces was enough for her to understand what had happened. None of us said a single word that night. We made a silent and unanimous decision. We would leave the region. The weight of what we had witnessed was unbearable. Before we departed, Ezekiel approached us one last time. "Don't tell this to anyone," he warned, his voice firm and serious. "When the authorities come, we handle them. The forest has memory, and if you continue drawing its attention, it may come back for you one day." Lucas and Ethan were registered as missing persons. Of course, there were searches, but I'm almost certain everything was controlled by the villagers. Their families blame us. They believe we did something, and in a way, I can't blame them. Years later, that forest still haunts me. In my dreams, I see the tall, imposing trees like dark guardians. Other times, it's the figure of the imbunch that appears, lurking in the shadows, as if it had never really let us go. I don't know if we'll ever be able to erase what we experienced there, but one thing is certain: we should never have crossed that boundary. I spent over 3 years living in a small courtyard apartment complex in Oak Ridge Heights. It was only during my final months there that I experienced something truly unsettling. The place was relatively spacious, with a shared courtyard, similar to many older complexes. On the right side, 6 apartments lined up one after another, and on the left, the same pattern mirrored them. My apartment was the third one from the entrance. To be honest, I never experienced anything strange there before this incident. I worked outside the home almost non-stop all day, and barely had contact with my neighbors, except for an elderly gentleman named Walter who lived next door. In the first apartment lived a family, a father, mother, and a small child. In the second, a young man about my age. The last 2 apartments had frequent tenant turnover, while the others had been there much longer. One night, quite late, a piercing scream woke me from my sleep. I jumped up immediately. The sound clearly came from the courtyard, a woman screaming. Still putting on my shoes and turning on the light, I heard Walter leaving his apartment. He was trying to talk to the young woman who had recently rented one of the back apartments. I had seen her around, but we'd never spoken. When I stepped outside, I saw that the woman was absolutely frantic, her nerves completely shot, her face flushed bright red. She was clutching Walter's arms, as if she needed the support to keep from collapsing. He tried to calm her, asking what had happened, and if there was someone inside her apartment. breathless and stammering. She could only repeat in terror that she had seen a woman hanging from the ceiling, suspended by a rope. "Miss, please try to calm yourself," Walter insisted. "If you don't tell us clearly what happened, we can't help you. Would you like me to go in and check?" The woman shook her head quickly, refusing. "No, no, don't. I saw her, an older woman hanging there." I felt deeply unsettled watching this scene. Believe me, if you had been there, you would have felt the same. She wasn't making this up. She was so distraught that even Walter was momentarily speechless. Then he tried once more to help her. "Do you have any relatives or friends who could come get you? I don't think you should spend the night here after all this." I offered to let her stay in my apartment, explaining that I didn't mind. She seemed trustworthy. However, Walter insisted it wasn't ideal. The shock had been enormous, and he feared the situation might worsen. The young woman agreed to call her boyfriend. While waiting, she stayed with the mother from the family in the first apartment. Shortly after, the father from that family arrived and asked what was happening. Walter, visibly irritated, explained, "It's that old beam in the ceiling, a wooden one connecting the last apartments. I've already told the landlord to remove it. It's from an old construction and only causes problems." He asked the young woman if we could take a look before she left. Reluctantly, she agreed. Walter then asked if we were willing to see it. The three of us followed him through her apartment to the room where he pointed to the beam in the ceiling, positioned directly above the bed. It was clearly ancient wood, standing out from the rest of the construction. "This is it. I've told them so many times to remove this thing, but the owner insists on keeping it, saying it's part of the history of the old boarding house that existed here years ago." Walter paused before continuing. "You know, when he bought this place, they stopped calling it a tenement because a woman had hanged herself here on this exact beam a year before I started renting. That was about 20 years ago. When I first arrived, the owner himself told me this story. This isn't the first time something like this has happened." He shook his head and continued, "Let me tell you something. This man keeps saying it's all made up, that it's all in people's heads. So I ask him, why can't anyone live in these two back apartments for very long? He never answers. But honestly, can you blame anyone who lives here? Even this young woman won't last long. Who could, after seeing something like that? An elderly woman hanging from this wood. God forbid, just looking at that old beam gives me shivers imagining what happened here." Although I hadn't seen anything supernatural, just hearing all this and standing in that room with that piece of wood in the ceiling gave me chills. I kept thinking about what the young woman must have felt. It must have been terrifying. Walter was right. We never saw her again. From what I heard, she sent someone to collect her things the next day. And for the rest of the time I lived there, that apartment remained empty. I don't know if the building is still standing today, but it was near a well-known street. There's now a large shrine to St. Jude with a display case, and everything on a nearby corner. Sometimes I wonder what I would have done if I had seen what she saw. How many nights could anyone sleep in a place like that after witnessing such a thing? I want to share something that happened to me back in 2008, during the height of the recession. My wife and I had fallen on hard times, and ended up living in one of those old boarding houses, the kind with paper-thin walls and creaking floorboards that you can still find in certain parts of rural New England. We'd only been there about a month, having moved into a rundown room on the second floor of this Victorian home that had been chopped up into separate living quarters. The property sat at the end of Wisteria Lane, just past where the pavement gives way to gravel. In that boarding house lived just the two of us, the owner, Mrs. Calloway, a stern woman in her 70s who managed the place, and supposedly the property owner, though he was more ghost than man. We rarely saw him. Just occasionally, his luxury sedan would appear in the driveway, and he'd spend maybe 20 minutes inspecting something before vanishing again. Mr. Pendleton was his name, though we never actually spoke to him. After living there for about a month, we'd learned everyone's schedules. Mrs. Calloway rose at precisely 5:30 each morning and retired by 9, and we knew Mr. Pendleton's sporadic visits never lasted longer than half an hour. It was as if his presence there was just a formality, like he kept a room simply to maintain some legal connection to the property. One night around midnight, I remember it was unusually cold for September. I stepped out onto the wraparound porch for a cigarette. The backyard was a shared space overgrown with weeds and fallen leaves, dotted with the skeletal remains of an old gazebo and a rusted garden swing. Everything about the place whispered of former elegance, long surrendered to decay. I was leaning against the porch railing when I noticed a woman standing near the dilapidated gazebo in the far corner of the yard. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with striking platinum blonde hair that seemed to catch what little moonlight filtered through the trees. She wore clothes that seemed oddly out of place, not inappropriate, but distinctly vintage, like something from the 1940s. A fitted dress with padded shoulders and silk stockings with a visible seam running up the back. What caught my attention initially was just a pinpoint of orange light in the darkness. She was smoking, and the ember of her cigarette had given away her presence. I felt uneasy, wondering if she might be connected to Mr. Pendleton. Perhaps she was his daughter, or maybe, given his rare appearances and the secrecy, a mistress. He wore a wedding band, after all. I slipped back inside and told my wife, who peeked through the curtains to confirm. She saw the woman too, her silhouette barely visible in the darkness. We spent hours speculating about who she might be, as we'd never seen anyone else at the property in the month we'd been there. 3 nights later, I was locking up the back gate as I often did when I spotted that same orange glow near the stone wall that bordered the property. Soon after, the woman emerged from the shadows. This time, she was walking slowly toward the house, getting within about 30 feet of where I stood. I decided to be neighborly. "Good evening," I called out softly. "Can I help you with something?" She didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge my presence. She continued walking as if I were completely invisible, her gaze fixed straight ahead. Something about her deliberate movement and the way she ignored me sent a chill through my body that had nothing to do with the autumn air. I retreated inside and double-locked the door. The following morning, as I was heading out to search for work, I spotted Mrs. Calloway pruning her small herb garden by the kitchen entrance. I decided to bring up what I'd seen. "Good morning, Mrs. Calloway. Everything all right?" I hope you don't mind me asking, but I've noticed a woman in the backyard the past few nights. Blonde hair, vintage clothes. Is she related to Mr. Pendleton, Mrs.? Calloway straightened up slowly, joints cracking, and gave me a look of resigned familiarity. I hope she didn't frighten you, dear. I suspect she's appeared because I forgot to light her candle this week. My arthritis has been acting up something fierce. I stood there, keys dangling forgotten in my hand. I'm sorry. What do you mean by her candle? She looked at me with a mixture of surprise and realization. Oh my, Mr. Pendleton hasn't told you about Miss Alina, has he? No, of course he wouldn't. That man avoids unpleasantness like it's his job. Miss Alina. The woman I saw in the backyard, Mrs. Calloway sighed and removed her gardening gloves. Come sit for a moment. You might want to hear this before you go. She gestured to a pair of weathered Adirondack chairs on the side porch. Once seated, she continued, her voice lowered despite there being no one else around. This property has quite a history that the real estate brochures conveniently omit. Before it was converted into a boarding house in the 1960s, this entire building was a speakeasy during Prohibition. The current backyard was where they held their more exclusive entertainments. She paused, as if choosing her words carefully. There were hidden passages connecting the main floor to secret rooms upstairs. Most have been sealed up now, though I suspect the one behind the pantry still works. They used these passages to move certain guests discreetly or to hide people when necessary. A chill ran through me as I began to understand where this was heading. Unfortunately, she continued, terrible things happened here. Many of the women who worked as entertainers and companions suffered greatly. Miss Alina was one of them. I had expected her to tell me this was some local myth or ghost story to scare newcomers, but instead, she pointed toward the back corner of the yard, near the crumbling stone wall. That's why I always place a candle on that flat stone in the corner, every week. When I do, nobody sees Miss Alina. I suspect you don't believe in such things, but both you and your wife have seen her, haven't you? As she spoke, she indicated a small, partially sheltered nook in the wall that I'd never noticed before. There, sitting on a flat stone, were the remnants of candle wax, and what appeared to be a small, weather-worn photograph in a rusted frame. You know, Mrs. Calloway continued, those candles never burn out naturally. Someone or something always extinguishes them or removes them entirely. Never once have I found melted wax pooled around, as you would expect. It's as if someone deliberately puts them out. But may she rest in peace, poor girl. Those were her final words on the subject, but they were more than enough. I couldn't ignore the fact that my wife had independently seen the same woman through the window, and I had encountered her twice myself. Fear took hold of us after that conversation. We began covering all our windows with heavy drapes at night, and I stopped going out to the yard after dark. I started hearing creaks and whispers in the walls that I'd previously attributed to the old house settling. My wife claimed she could smell cigarette smoke drifting through our bathroom vent in the middle of the night, though neither of us smoked indoors. 3 weeks later, we managed to find a better place to live. With my wife 4 months pregnant, we needed someplace more stable anyway. We moved out on a Sunday when Mrs. Calloway was at church, leaving our forwarding address with a brief thank you note. 7 years later, a consulting job took me back to that same town. Feeling a strange pull of curiosity, I drove down Wisteria Lane to see what had become of the old boarding house. What I found was an empty lot covered in construction materials. The Victorian house was completely gone. During lunch at a nearby diner, I asked the server what had happened to the old place. She explained that about 2 years prior, a fire had destroyed the entire structure. It had started mysteriously in the middle of the night, but fortunately, the building had been vacant for renovation. The property had never been rebuilt, and rumors were that insurance wouldn't cover it due to suspicious circumstances. Some say they found evidence the fire started in multiple places at once. The server added in a hushed tone, but the investigation was suddenly dropped. Word is the owner, Pendleton, I think, paid good money to make sure it didn't go further. I remembered Mrs. Calloway's words about the candles being deliberately extinguished. Had someone finally decided to permanently erase the memory of Miss Aliner? Or was it just coincidence? As I drove past the empty lot one final time before leaving town, I noticed something that made me pull over. There in the far corner where the stone wall still partially stood, a single flame flickered, a tea light candle placed on a flat stone, protected from the wind by a small glass jar. Someone was still remembering her. I sometimes wonder if Miss Aliner still appears on that empty lot, now covered in construction materials and half-finished foundation work. Does she still walk her path, searching for something or someone from long ago? Was the fire just an accident, or did someone truly try to prevent her from finding rest? Some mysteries, I've learned, are better left unsolved, but I still find myself avoiding smoking outdoors after dark. I've always had a certain fascination with what people call the deep web. Stories about its darkest and most disturbing corners always intrigued me. Places nobody should explore, filled with secrets that shouldn't be revealed. It might sound strange, but this only fueled my curiosity. Nothing, however, could have prepared me for what I found in what was called the Butcher's Forum. It all began innocently enough on a frigid December night in Boston, 2019. I was bored, sitting in my studio apartment, the radiator clanking as snow piled up outside my window. Random clicks led me deeper and deeper into forgotten corners of the internet. The further I went, the more I left behind anything resembling the everyday web. Then suddenly, there it was. The page was rudimentary, with an outdated design from the early 2000s, but its purpose was unmistakable, connecting people with interests that transcended the boundaries of what's acceptable. The administrator claimed everything was fictional, but the texts were described with frightening precision. At first, I thought it was just another space for bizarre fantasies, but then I reached the listings. This wasn't merely about discussing cannibalism. People were offering themselves or seeking volunteers to become meals. The messages were carefully crafted, vague enough to avoid explicit confessions, but the intentions were evident. This didn't seem like a place for macabre jokes or roleplay. This felt real. I should have shut my laptop immediately and tried to forget what I'd seen, but I stayed. Part of me believed it was all an elaborate prank, a grotesque space created solely to shock and entertain. I convinced myself I was just a curious observer, a digital anthropologist studying a bizarre subculture. That's when I found something that froze me to my core, a journal written by someone who claimed to have actually consumed human flesh. The author didn't reveal their identity. Nobody. They used real names. But the way they described the details seemed genuine. Too genuine. They narrated how they had met a man online, someone who no longer wanted to live, and how they arranged a meeting in rural Vermont. This man wished to be consumed, a request the author accepted. I read the text with a knot in my stomach, but I couldn't stop. The author described their meeting almost casually, as if they were old friends reconnecting. They had dinner together first, a regular meal as part of some kind of ritualistic prelude, before proceeding to a room meticulously prepared for the act. The space had been lined with plastic, and tools, knives, and hooks were arranged in an organized, almost surgical manner. What made everything even more disturbing was that the volunteer, as he was called, had been calm throughout. He arrived carrying a sealed envelope containing a document expressing his consent. The author reported asking one final time if he was certain about his decision. The man reportedly responded with an affirmative smile. That's when everything began. The descriptions that followed were nauseating. The author wrote about the knife, the blood, and how the body reacted. They spoke of sounds, smells, reporting everything with a detached precision. For them, it was essential to respect the volunteer's wish, making the moment meaningful. There was no hatred, anger, or haste, only a kind of reverent ritual. The details about the flesh, texture, appearance, preparation were shocking. The author described how they cooked, seasoned, and finally consumed the meat. I knew I should have stopped reading, but I couldn't. It was like watching a disaster unfold before my eyes, horrible, but impossible to ignore. The writing had a brutal realism, more vivid than anything I had ever read. It wasn't just the graphic details. There was something deeper, the emotional weight placed in each line. That's what really gave me chills. The writer didn't seem to be trying to shock or get attention. It was like a sincere confession, almost a catharsis, laden with a palpable sadness. It seemed that what they had done had marked them in ways they themselves didn't yet understand. When I finally closed my laptop, dawn light was already filtering through the blinds of my apartment. I felt exhausted, empty, with a knot in my stomach, as if something irreversible had happened. I tried to convince myself it was all an invented story, but it was futile. The details, the way they wrote, everything remained vivid in my mind. As I showered and prepared to sleep, it continued hammering in my thoughts, insistent and suffocating. In the days that followed, I couldn't disconnect from what I had read. I sought distractions, but nothing helped. The narrative always returned, like an echo pursuing me. I began having nightmares where I was the person lying on the table, waiting for the blade. I would wake up sweating, my heart racing, mouth dry. I promised myself I would never access that site again, but the attraction was uncontrollable. I needed to know more, needed to understand. So I returned. The journal entry was still there, untouched, along with many other older stories. Some were less detailed, others even more disturbing. Some seemed false, exaggerated, but others had an undeniably authentic tone, like the first one I had read. And I read them all, one by one. Each account pulled me deeper. I spent almost 3 weeks unable to eat meat. The simple act of looking at it brought back the vivid descriptions from the text. Despite this, I couldn't stay away. I became completely obsessed, spending hours on the site, exploring archives, analyzing patterns. I began to notice connections between posts, as if some users actually knew each other. They made references to previous events, exchanged tips. What had first appeared to be just a space for sharing morbid stories now revealed itself as a secret community of cannibals, hidden beneath the surface of the common internet. It was on one of those nights, my eyes already glazed over from staring at the screen, that I came across a new post from the same user who wrote the first journal entry. They had returned with another account, but something seemed different this time. They described what happened afterward, how they couldn't get it out of their head, how they desperately craved the sensation of absolute power they had experienced. They tried to resume a normal life, but were unable to. The taste, the act itself, had transformed them. They recounted finding another volunteer who wished to end their life. The process was described again, but now the tone was darker, laden with desperation. There was no longer the same reverence as the first time. Everything seemed driven by compulsion. They related the guilt and shame they felt, but also spoke about the momentary peace it brought them, as if it were the only way to appease their internal torment. I spent 2 or 3 days completely immersed in the Butcher's Forum. I stopped leaving my apartment, avoided friends and family, any contact that might betray the change happening inside me. My world narrowed to the cold light of the laptop screen and the incessant flow of texts and stories. My dreams transformed. They were no longer nightmares of fear, but dreams so real they seemed tangible. And in them, I was no longer the volunteer. Now I was the one holding the knife. It was after a long conversation with a close friend that I understood my fixation with the Butcher's Forum was actually a reflection of unresolved depression connected to my mother's death from cancer 3 years earlier. It might seem like a strange leap, but it wasn't. I think I had never completely processed the emotions tied to that loss. Reading about that methodical process of death and dismemberment forced me to confront something I didn't understand at the time. That conversation, almost like a click, brought a new way of seeing things. After that, I stopped accessing the site, and for some time, I managed to put the matter aside. However, everything came rushing back when I heard that the administrator of the Butcher's Forum had been arrested in northern Michigan. He had killed and consumed someone, exactly as the stories related in the site's posts. I had convinced myself that it was all a bizarre performance maintained by deeply disturbed people with dark fantasies. But discovering that a man called Samuel Weiss had been detained destroyed any vestige of that illusion. It was a shock that made me realize the world is even darker than I had imagined. I've never told anyone this story until now. Sometimes I wonder if I should have reported what I found to the authorities, if I could have somehow prevented what happened to that last victim. But then I remember that in that twisted online world, nothing was as it seemed. Names were false, locations obscured, identities hidden behind layers of encryption. The most terrifying part, The forum is probably still out there, just under a different name, on a different server, continuing its gruesome trade. And somewhere, someone else might be falling down that same rabbit hole, unable to look away from the horror, just as I was. I haven't ventured back into the deep web since then. Some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed again. Sometimes, late at night, when I can't sleep, I wonder if the author of those journal entries is still out there, still hunting, still feeding their insatiable hunger. And I wonder how many others like them lurk in the shadows of our world, hiding in plain sight. I'm originally from a small town in northern Maine, and back in 2012, I had to relocate to Detroit because of a job opportunity that I simply couldn't pass up. Among several complicated reasons I won't get into right now, finding housing quickly became my most pressing concern. An old college friend offered me temporary accommodation in a house that belonged to his family while I got myself settled. Since I had already left my hometown, I desperately needed somewhere to stay on short notice. Thanks to this friend, I had a roof over my head for a few days. The agreement was that it would be brief, a week at most, according to what my new employer had told me. The house was located in an isolated part of eastern Detroit, in an old industrial housing complex. It was a simple property, nothing fancy. I have to admit, the street made me uneasy, unpaved, with a heavy atmosphere hanging over everything. I ended up staying there for 5 days. The housing complex was old and poorly maintained, with few people visible around. It was strange. You wouldn't see anyone walking about, just distant echoes of voices occasionally, as if the walls were too thick to let sounds pass through properly. Curiously, the only movements happened in the middle of the night. I'd hear footsteps outside, but I preferred not to look, avoiding appearing nosy or reckless. My friend had already warned me to be careful, to buy everything I needed on the first day, and not to go out much since the area was dangerous. On the 6th day, everything changed. At 7 in the morning, someone began pounding on the door with such force they nearly broke it down. I heard authoritative voices ordering me to come out with my hands up. I opened the door, terrified, and saw police officers everywhere. There were many of them running and shouting throughout the complex. Behind them, an elderly man and woman appeared, saying something about me being a newcomer and a friend of someone they knew. This couple pulled me away with them, and without understanding anything, I found myself at the corner of the street with several police patrol cars, at least 7 or 10. The officers were surrounding the place, breaking down aluminum and metal doors while shouting and searching everything. I asked the couple what was happening. They explained that they lived there, and knowing my friend's family, had intervened so I wouldn't be mistaken for someone involved. That's when they revealed something disturbing. In the last house of the complex, people were being held against their will. This couple already knew what. Some stories don't find their way to us by accident. The one I'm about to share is the kind that makes you question what's real and what lies beyond our understanding. This account takes us to a time where faith, friendship, and the inexplicable intersected in ways that still echo in my memory. My name is Marcus. I'm a historian fascinated by legends and supernatural stories. I never imagined I'd publicly share the events I experienced, but today I've decided to change that. I want to share something profound so that more people might understand the unseen forces that guide our paths. This story happened when I was 18, back in 1997, long before Twilight or other films that romanticize vampires. In those days, entertainment options for young people in rural New England were severely limited. My family was deeply religious, and as the youngest, I followed this tradition, accompanying my mother and siblings to church. From an early age, I nurtured a strong belief in the supernatural world, though I had my own way of perceiving these things. One Sunday, a peculiar young man appeared at our church. His appearance was curious and difficult to define at first glance. He seemed to be in his early 20s, but sometimes gave the impression of being much older, perhaps even in his 30s. His name was Thomas. He was good-looking, but there was something unusual about him. Even as a young man, I was observant and curious, so we eventually grew closer and became friends. Thomas began visiting my house, where we had a tradition of singing hymns and praying with the youth group. However, everyone noticed that he was different. While we were cheerful, laughing, and at ease, he often remained silent with a serious, distant expression. This bothered me, leaving me with a certain apprehension. Later, we learned that Thomas had struggled with drug problems and showed signs of schizophrenia. But those details will be clarified at the end of my account. One night he stayed at my house. At that time, we lived in an old farmhouse that belonged to the company where my father worked. Although located in Vermont, the property had an ancient and mysterious air. There were stories of apparitions, a woman dressed in white and a man in black, reported by previous residents. On the grounds, we found pieces of old chains and antique coins beneath the stone floor. The house, built on a slope, had a tall basement that contributed to its somber atmosphere. That night, Thomas slept on the floor of the room I shared with my brother. My brother fell asleep quickly, but I remained alert, wary of Thomas's presence. I noticed he seemed restless, which made me even more vigilant. I asked if everything was okay, and he replied that it was. But as minutes passed, it became clear that something was troubling him. He seemed to need to unburden himself. I sat up in bed and asked directly if he wanted to talk. I've always been more of a listener than a talker. He sat up too and began. I need to tell you something that's been tormenting me. I hope you can understand. I had noticed signs that he used drugs. Yellowed fingers with burnt tips gave it away. In the area where I lived, this problem was well known, and I had already lost friends to it. I thought he would start talking about drugs, but the conversation took a different turn. Thomas began by recalling his childhood in Boston. He told me he had a good life thanks to his stepfather, who was a federal agent and ensured he received a solid education. However, after his stepfather's death, he entered adolescence somewhat rebellious and began exploring life in the city. He found a job as a waiter in a restaurant near a university. It was here that his narrative took on a heavier, more engaging tone. One day at work, Thomas met Eliza, an enchanting young woman with hair as black as night and skin as pale as porcelain. She won people over with her charm and charisma. Thomas couldn't resist her allure and they quickly began a relationship that lasted several months, during which he felt fulfilled and happy by her side. Everything changed, however, when Thomas encountered an old childhood friend. On that occasion, Eliza was with him. As soon as the friend saw her, the atmosphere became strange. Eliza was uncomfortable, but the friend's reaction was even more intense. He displayed fear and dread. The conversation between them was brief, but sufficient to awaken in Thomas a strong feeling that something wasn't right. Extremely troubled, he imagined that perhaps the two had a past involvement, or even something recent that she was hiding. He spent the night tormented by these ideas. The next day, Thomas decided to clear his doubts and asked Eliza directly if she knew his friend. She replied that she did, saying they had worked together in the past, but she barely remembered the details. This answer didn't convince him. Determined to understand the strange situation, he obtained his friend's address through a relative and went to his house seeking answers. As soon as Thomas asked the question, the friend, visibly shaken, pleaded, "For God's sake, Thomas, break up with that woman. She's not what she seems. She's a witch or a vampire, I don't know. Get out while you can." Thomas, of course, found all of this absurd. He had known his friend for a long time and believed it was just a joke or an exaggeration, but the friend insisted. "I'll tell you what happened to me. We worked together, and gradually we created a friendship where we shared secrets. One day she came to me very nervous and asked to confide in me. She said I seemed trustworthy. I told her she could speak freely. Then, almost without courage, she told me, 'Philip, I'm a vampire. Do you believe me?' At that moment, I laughed uncontrollably. I thought she was messing with me, but when I stopped, I realized her eyes were full of tears, as if this was something that truly troubled her. Curious, I asked her to show me her fangs to prove it was true. She refused, saying I would be shocked, that I couldn't handle it and would distance myself from her, as others had done before. I spent the whole day laughing at the story, provoking her to transform, almost to the point of irritating her, until at one moment she looked at me and said, "You really want to see? Fine then. I bet a case of beer." Of course, I accepted, thinking it was just a silly joke. We arranged to meet at the town cemetery at midnight. I was sure it would be something funny, like using plastic teeth or something. Philip paused, took a deep breath, and continued. When I arrived, she was at the entrance of the cemetery dressed casually, jeans and a simple blouse, with nothing in her hands. I was surprised by her seriousness. We went to the center of the cemetery under a lamppost, and she positioned herself in front of me, lowered her face, put her hands behind her back, and murmured something incomprehensible. It seemed like another language. When she raised her face, everything had changed. Her face was deformed with enormous fangs, and her hands looked aged, with sharp, long nails. I screamed like never before and ran away in panic. I jumped over a low wall, tripped, and fainted on the other side. When I woke up, she had already returned to normal and tried to help me, but I didn't want any conversation. I fled and never returned to work. The friend ended with a plea. "Thomas, you may think it's madness, but don't risk it. Get out before something worse happens to you." Thomas was overwhelmed with panic. Sweat was running down his face. His hands were trembling, and his mind couldn't stop replaying what he had heard. He felt paralyzed, with his heart racing and a constant sensation of threat. When he got home, the story wouldn't leave his head. The fear of confronting Eliza and asking her directly consumed him. That night he couldn't sleep, spending hours holding his own neck in a mixture of prayer and desperation, anxiously awaiting dawn. The days that followed were confusing. Doubt was eating away at Thomas, who needed to know the truth, but the fear of facing the answer held him back. Until, in a moment of courage, he decided to tell Eliza everything his friend had said. She listened calmly and at the end let out a laugh. "That's crazy. Your friend just wanted to scare you. Can you imagine me being a witch, or worse yet, a vampire?" Despite her lightness, Thomas couldn't get it out of his head. He continued insisting and questioning for days. But Eliza maintained the same stance, vehemently denying everything. Until, in an outburst of frustration, he declared that if he didn't get a truthful answer, he would pack his bags and leave. That's when she, with a serious look, admitted, "Yes, it's true." The ground seemed to disappear from under Thomas. He didn't know how to process that confession. Even hearing her words, his mind refused to accept it. He needed proof. "Then show me. Transform now. I need to see with my own eyes." Eliza shook her head negatively. "I will never do that for you. If I transform, I know you'll abandon me, and I don't want to lose you." Despite his pleas, she remained firm. When he realized they wouldn't make progress, Thomas asked one last question. "Then at least tell me how it all began." Eliza took a deep breath and began to recount. "When I was a teenager, I got pregnant. My furious parents kicked me out of the house. I suffered a lot, trying to take care of my daughter alone. I fell into a deep depression, and one day I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I left the house intending to end it all. I went to a park, sat on a wooden bench, and thought about how to end that suffering. That's when a man appeared in front of me. He was tall, very well dressed, and asked if he could sit beside me." Eliza continued with distant eyes, as if reliving the scene. "I said yes. He sat down, looked at me, and said I didn't need to be afraid, that my life would improve. He said I was special, that I had an important mission on earth, and that he could give me joy and power. He said if I accepted, I would never feel sadness again. I asked who he was, and how he knew about my situation. He put his arm around me, squeezed me, and replied, 'My child, I am Lucifer. Don't be afraid. I am good and I know your purpose.'" Thomas listened in silence, astonished, as Eliza continued. I was speechless. He stood up and said he would soon contact me again. He walked until he disappeared behind a tree. At that moment, the sadness I felt completely vanished. I became curious, eager to meet him again. Some time later, he appeared again. It was night, and I was sleeping in my room. When I opened my eyes, there he was, standing in front of me. He was different this time. He was still very tall, about 6.5 feet, but he wore a white tunic and had long black hair. When his hair moved, I saw a sun design on his back. His face was so beautiful, so perfect that no woman could resist. But looking down, I noticed something strange under the tunic. I saw the hoof of an animal. Still, I didn't feel afraid. He seemed familiar, and his presence brought peace. The story ended, but Thomas felt as if the world around him had changed. It wasn't the devil described in the Bible or in church sermons. He was different, and somehow I was open to listening to him. He explained that he would grant me a rare power, reserved for few on earth. However, there was a condition. I would need to bite 3 virgins to seal the pact. This would be a commitment of life and loyalty because, according to him, one day evil would triumph over those who pretend to be good. He also talked about how his strength resided in technology. He said his influence already crossed oceans, connecting nations, and that through this technology and his messages, he would reach men and women worldwide, illuminating many. After long instructions and explanations about the power I would receive, he asked if I accepted. I said yes. Then he asked me to kneel, repeat his words, and open my mind to receive it. I did as he asked. The moment I repeated the words, kneeling, I felt my body burn as if it were in flames. It was unbearable pain. He held my hand and told me not to be afraid, asking me to look at my transformed form in the mirror. When I saw myself, I immediately fainted. I only woke up the next day. During the days that followed, I began to transform, hiding in the bathroom. Gradually, I got used to it. And yes, I finalized the pact by biting 3 virgins, or perhaps 3 virgin men, I'm not sure. Thomas, overwhelmed with confusion, asked if she couldn't free herself from that situation. She replied, I can't anymore. If I tried to leave, my daughter and everyone around me would pay for it. The condition would be infinitely worse than before making the pact. Besides, I can't die. Both my body and my soul belong to him now. Thomas insisted that she transform, but again she refused. It's better for you to forget all this, she stated. He then asked, what if it were for my mother? Would you transform for her? After thinking, Eliza said that perhaps yes, but he would need to guarantee that his mother wouldn't end up like her after the transformation. He promised he would protect his mother. Days later, they visited Thomas's mother. He explained the entire situation and begged for the truth to be revealed once and for all, ending any doubt. The mother agreed, albeit hesitantly. They sat face to face, with Thomas beside Eliza. He lowered his face and covered it with a towel, promising not to look. Eliza lowered her head and began to murmur incomprehensible words in a strange language. When she raised her face and looked directly at Thomas's mother, the woman let out a scream and fainted instantly. Thomas ran to help her, while Eliza took refuge in the bathroom, returning shortly after to help. When the mother regained consciousness, she was overcome with fear. In desperation, she begged her son to end the relationship. What I saw cannot be a good thing, Thomas. You are in danger. The days that followed were heavy. Fear and rejection grew inside him until he made the decision to leave home and break up with Eliza. But the breakup was the beginning of his downfall. As Eliza had warned, the separation brought disgrace. He fell into a deep depression, started using drugs, and ended up living on the streets, developing signs of schizophrenia. I spoke with Thomas's mother when she came to live in our area. She was a kind woman, despite battling brain cancer. She told me this story with the same details, in a way that seemed extremely sincere. I believe her. After this period, my family left that neighborhood, and we eventually lost contact with them. Years later, Thomas appeared at our house a few times, but eventually disappeared for good. I heard he worked at the town's DMV and later at a local university. But it's been a long time since I've seen him. I also heard that he had confided his story to a professor at that university. But no one ever confirmed this. Thomas, for his part, said he fully believed in everything he experienced. He reported that once a student who claimed to be part of an order dedicated to nature worship invited him to learn about the group's rituals. During this experience, the women present were naked, and according to him, upon having intimate contact with them, he felt a large part of his vital energy being drained. After the incident, he was left without strength, completely exhausted. Another strange event was reported by someone from the church. She recounted that on an ordinary day at her house, something sinister happened. A young woman who was present suddenly lowered her head, became motionless, and began to scream repeatedly, "He's going to get me." The episode continued with her repeating the phrase several times while a loud sound came from the bathroom, as if someone had thrown a basketball against the shower door. The woman's son, who was also my friend, rushed to see what had happened. When he arrived there, he found absolutely nothing. However, upon returning to the living room, he found his mother in a state of shock, and the young woman completely transformed. Her face was disfigured, 2 enormous fangs had emerged, and her nails were elongated and sharp. It was an episode of spiritual trance that lasted until she returned to normal. But the most shocking thing is what happened afterward. This friend, the woman's son, ended up being murdered. He had become involved in the world of drugs and suffered a brutal and cruel death that brought immense suffering to the family. The trauma was so devastating that the parents separated. To this day, I wonder if all of this wasn't some kind of consequence of the forces involved that day. The dark web is an obscure corner, a kind of abyss where humanity's worst impulses flourish. That's precisely where I operate. My work involves being a white hat hacker, the kind of specialist who, instead of causing damage, gets paid to dismantle illegal markets, follow trails leading to hidden criminals, and bring some clarity to the darkness. I spend most of my time in front of monitors, their cold glow illuminating my small, cluttered apartment in Seattle. My fingers move quickly across the keyboard, breaking through encrypted layers and revealing secrets most people would never dare seek. It's not a job for the faint-hearted, but I'm damn good at it. I've faced things that would make anyone lose sleep, scenes no one should ever witness. Yet the case that left an indelible mark on my mind began like any other. A routine analysis that led me to an online marketplace buried in the darkest depths of the web during the harsh winter of 2018. The site offered human lives as if they were products, children, adults, with sharp images and cold descriptions. I had seen such things before, but there was something different about this marketplace. It was sophisticated, meticulously planned, and shrouded in an unsettling quietude, almost as if daring someone to try to infiltrate it. I began dismantling its defenses line by line, like peeling an onion. The work was time-consuming, exhausting, and full of obstacles, as the site was created by someone with a profound understanding of digital security. But no system is completely fail-proof. After 5 days of continuous effort, I managed to break in. The database was extensive, with frighteningly detailed information, names of victims, ages, photos, and meticulous descriptions of their functions. Each file seemed to silently scream for help, imprisoned in a universe of code. As I worked, I extracted information, cross-referenced patterns, and formed a bigger picture. As usual, I carefully documented everything, preparing a report that could be delivered to the authorities once the site was taken down. It was during this process that I found her, a girl from Montana, probably only 13 years old. The photo showed a child with large, fear-filled eyes trying to smile. The profile was disturbingly detailed in a way that made me nauseated. But what really caught my attention was an unusual note in the metadata. A payment record that, instead of indicating a buyer, pointed to her own family. I decided to search for the girl's name in all available databases. I cross-referenced information about missing persons, social media posts, and old news reports. The trail was subtle, but it was there. I discovered she had disappeared months earlier, with the last record coming from a small mining town in Montana's remote countryside. The local media barely mentioned the case, and strangely, her parents never reported her disappearance. On the contrary, something unexpected had happened in their lives. I found photos on Facebook where they appeared in front of a much larger house than the one they previously owned, showing off expensive clothes and hosting lavish parties. There were posts thanking God for a blessing they had received. It was hard to believe how a family that lived in extreme poverty could suddenly have resources for all this. The pieces came together like a cruel puzzle that I would give anything not to have solved. They had sold their own daughter, flesh of their flesh, delivered into the hands of monsters in exchange for comfort and a better life. I stared at the screen with a churning stomach, feeling bile rise. It wasn't just the marketplace. It was the betrayal, the abandonment, the coldness of turning a child into currency. I've always maintained professionalism in my work, but this time something changed. I couldn't stop thinking about her. She ceased to be just another record in the database and became a real girl, discarded, forgotten, crushed by the people who should have protected her above all else. I decided to dig deeper, scrutinizing every detail about the family, financial records, private messages, any clue I could find. The evidence was as clear as it was revolting. The deposit coincided with the day she disappeared, and the money was gradually squandered on luxuries, parties, expensive clothes, and ostentatious displays. There was no doubt they not only collaborated, but were prospering from the horror she was living through. With each discovery, anger grew within me. My work had always been technical, focused on dismantling systems and exposing networks, never on judging people. But this had become personal. I couldn't erase from my mind the image of her, the fake smile, the fear emblazoned in those large eyes. She seemed to look at me every time I closed my eyes. I spent weeks building a complete case, gathering evidence that would be incontestable when it reached the authorities. This was my protocol. This was how I always handled these cases. But the thought that that family was living comfortably while she suffered consumed me. They had bought happiness with her life, and that was monstrous. It was on one of those nights, while reviewing the final data under the aurora borealis that occasionally graced the Seattle sky, that I made a decision. I wouldn't just hand over the evidence, and move on as I always did. They needed to feel the weight of what they had done. They needed to remember her, to see the consequences of the cruel act they had committed. I prepared an anonymous email, impossible to trace. In the attachment, I placed the photos of their daughter that I found on the marketplace, edited to preserve her dignity, but unmistakable. I sent it without any message, just the images. I wanted them to face it, to be consumed by the memory of what they had done. I don't know if they opened the email, but I like to imagine that guilt corroded them, slow and relentless like poison. A few days later, the marketplace went offline, erased from the dark web. My work there was done, and the American authorities had everything they needed to track that network of horrors. But her face stayed with me, like a shadow I can't shake off. Sometimes I like to think she's alive somewhere, that the fall of that system gave her a chance to escape. But I know the reality of the dark web well, and I know it rarely releases its victims. Still, each day I take down a different monster, because if I don't do it, who will? In this endless digital wilderness, where predators lurk in the shadows of code and encryption, I am the hunter who walks alone. The nightmares come and go, but I've made peace with them. They're the price I pay for doing what I do, for being the one who stares into the abyss, and sometimes drags its monsters into the light. There are days when I wonder if it's worth it, if one person can really make a difference in this vast ocean of darkness. But then I remember her eyes, and I know the answer. For every child I cannot save, there might be another I can. And that possibility, however slim, is what keeps me going night after night, in this silent war that most of the world doesn't even know is being fought. I live in Blackwater Ridge, a small town tucked away in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. But my name isn't important. What matters is the story I've never had the courage to tell anyone until now. It's about something I experienced when I was 16, something that defies what most consider natural. Back then, I started working to help with household bills. Since I attended night school in another part of town, I used my bicycle to commute everywhere, from home to work to school and back, without any fear, even when crossing rural areas after dark. I knew those roads well, and believed that my 6'3" frame and 190 pounds would be enough to deter any trouble. But on March 26, 2007, I discovered not everyone thought the same way. Returning from school, I decided to take a shortcut through a dirt path that crossed private property. The sky was clear, dotted with stars, and even without a full moon, visibility was perfect. After a rough day, the cool night air brought some relief as I pedaled along the trail. I could hear the usual rural sounds, goats bleating in the distance, dogs barking near an illuminated house, frogs croaking hidden nearby. Everything was peaceful until suddenly, the animal noises stopped, as if someone had flipped a switch. Only the wind, rustling through the trees, remained. Instinctively, I stopped to understand what was happening. That's when I saw something large, about the size of a donkey, moving among the farm animals. It grabbed something from the ground and awkwardly bolted toward the front of a nearby house. My first thought was that one of the guard dogs had escaped. I jumped back on my bike and started pedaling hard to get away. After all, farm dogs aren't usually small or friendly. As I distanced myself, an unbearable stench began to permeate the air, like a mixture of rotting garbage and sulfur. I pedaled faster, but as I rounded a narrow bend, I collided head-on with an enormous black animal crossing the trail toward the woods. I couldn't stop in time and hit the creature's side with full force. We both fell to the ground. The first thing I noticed was the thick, oily fur, followed by a sound that mixed growling and grunting. My mind still wanted to believe it was just a dog, but it wasn't. With my body aching, I quickly got up without taking my eyes off the creature. It also rose, and the image before me froze me in place. It was enormous, taller than me, with the appearance of a monstrous black dog, hairy and tailless. But its posture and body contour resembled something else. The muzzle, similar to a dog's, displayed sharp teeth, but there was something human about that face partially covered with fur. And the smell was nauseating. For a few moments, we stared at each other. My heart felt like it would explode in my throat, while my eyes tried to comprehend what they were seeing. Everything happened in seconds, but it felt like time had stopped. Then the beast put its hand to its abdomen where I had hit it, as if injured. It growled softly, then let out a deafening roar and lunged at me. My immediate reaction was to scream and use my bicycle as both shield and weapon. I hit and pushed that thing with it, trying to keep it away. In desperation, I headbutted its muzzle. I don't know if I connected properly, but the beast let out another roar while my head exploded with pain. Before I could do anything else, I received a violent blow to my chest that sent me flying. Then I felt a tug on my leg, followed by sharp impacts on my back, face, neck, and chest. The creature held me by one leg and slammed me to the ground with brutal force, as if I were a toy. The taste of blood filled my mouth, and my vision blurred as I felt crushing pressure on my head. I tried punching and kicking it with my free leg, but everything seemed useless. At that moment, I thought it was going to kill me right there. That's when I heard voices and dogs barking, rapidly approaching, followed by 4 or 5 gunshots. The creature finally released me. Yes, it had fingers, strong ones. It growled softly near my face, as if wanting to whisper something, then disappeared, running toward the woods. My head was spinning, but I tried to get up, only to be attacked by a pack of dogs that bit my legs and arms mercilessly. I don't know if any of them went after the monster, or if they were just focused on me. Thankfully, people arrived and drove the dogs away. As I tried to recover, still dazed, the property owner approached with a revolver in his hand and pointed it at me. "What the hell were you doing here?" he demanded. I could only laugh nervously. After everything, it seemed I was going to end up dead from a bullet or the dogs. Between laughs, I replied honestly, "I was actually hoping you could tell me." While some kept asking who I had been fighting with, a young man named Jackson, who had played basketball with me before, exclaimed, "Fight." "No way." "I saw a huge beast run into the woods," the property owner retorted. "If it was just an animal, why's the boy talking?" The man, who must have been in his 60s, agreed to take me inside his house despite his wife's resistance. She didn't want any trouble. In the living room, still holding his revolver, he gave me a glass of water and asked, "Where do you live?" "Got a phone number to call your folks." At that time, we didn't have a phone at home, but a neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, did. His wife called her, and gave her the address so my family could come get me. She explained that I had entered their property to take a shortcut and their dogs had attacked me, but assured them I was okay. I continued alternating between nervous laughter and crying, unable to believe what had just happened. When my parents arrived in our old Ford Taurus, along with my paternal grandmother who lived with us, I didn't even have a chance to thank the man for his help. My father quickly put me in the car and drove straight to the hospital. My left femur had dislocated from my hip socket, and the pain increased as the adrenaline wore off. At the hospital, the doctors took good care of me and suggested I stay overnight for observation. To be honest, I was relieved because I didn't want to go back home knowing I'd have to pass by that road again. But my grandmother was adamant, saying this was a family matter, and insisted so much that we ended up returning home that same night. On the way back, I told them every detail of what had happened. My father seemed terrified, bombarding me with questions. My mother, on the other hand, didn't believe me. She asked if someone had given me something strange at school, suggesting I might have been drugged and imagined a monster while fighting with dogs. My grandmother remained silent. When we arrived home and I heard the door close, I broke down. I started crying like a small child and clung to my mother. My father tried to pull me close, but was interrupted by my grandmother, who took me by the hand and ordered me to go straight to the shower. "You stink," she said, and it was true. The smell of that creature still permeated my clothes. In the bathroom, leaning against the wall as the water ran down, I cried nonstop. The cuts and scratches stung, bled, and the pain in my head was constant, the consequence of having it nearly crushed like a fruit. Despite the anesthesia, my injured leg still bothered me. Even so, what hurt most was the memory of that encounter. When I came out of the shower, I found my family waiting for me with my favorite meal: steak, loaded baked potatoes, and corn on the cob. I've always had a voracious appetite, but that day I could barely nibble on some potatoes. It was impossible to swallow anything. I felt like the dirt and grass that creature had made me swallow were still inside me. During dinner, the conversation was tense. My father, not knowing how to handle the situation, started asking questions in German and Ukrainian, languages from our heritage. My grandmother observed me carefully, asking if I felt anything strange. My mother, meanwhile, persisted with the same questions as before, insinuating that I might be involved with drugs or something illicit. All this accumulated until I exploded, slamming my fist on the table and shouting, "Everything's fine. I'm not the lady's goddamn junkie brother. I just went for a little ride with a hairy dog thing on my bike, and as you can see, we ended up fighting in the woods." My father tried to calm me down and took me to my room. Still, sleep was impossible. I spent the night awake, looking out the window as the sky brightened. When morning came, my grandmother entered the room, whispering in Ukrainian. She told me not to go to work that day. That's when I remembered I'd already been fired the previous day, after less than 3 months on the job. But that seemed irrelevant now. My father seemed to accept everything with more tranquility. I spent the morning in my room, analyzing the consequences of the attack. I took off my clothes and observed each mark. A dislocated femur, 31 stitches between my chest and left shoulder, 15 on my forearm, 2 on my forehead, 2 on my lower lip. Additionally, there were bruises all over my body, countless scratches, and 6 dog bites. After a while, I went to the kitchen and sat talking with my grandmother while my parents left for work. Sitting at the table, I looked at her and confessed, "I don't know what happened. I got into a fight with some creature. I don't even know what it was. I hope it was a bear." My grandmother didn't hesitate. She responded in Ukrainian, using a word that meant werewolf. Although I had thought about it too, I preferred to laugh off the situation. The day passed quickly, but when night began to fall, something changed inside me. For the first time, I felt afraid of the dark. I just wanted to hide under the quilt and forget everything. However, each time I dozed off, that monster returned in my dreams, shaking me as if I were a toy. 2 days later, my father and grandmother suggested I move into the caretaker's house, which had been empty for some time. It would be a quiet place for me. The house was simple, with a small bedroom, a living room with a fireplace, a kitchen, and a tiny bathroom. My furniture barely fit, but I accepted without thinking much. Beyond the peace and quiet, I imagined that having my own space might open opportunities, especially with the daughter of one of my mother's cousins. I spent the next day anxious, almost forgetting what had happened. When Friday arrived, March 29th, 2007, my excitement only grew. I felt so hot that I seemed feverish. At night, I stripped down to my underwear, opened the window, and threw myself on the bed. As the heat increased, my wounds began to itch, and I gently ran my fingers over them, trying to relieve the discomfort. But the heat wasn't coming from outside. It was internal, as if I were burning from the inside out. After a few minutes, my eyes began to burn as if they were inflamed, and the sensation only worsened. Meanwhile, my vision changed. The world became as bright as day, but tinged with yellow and orange hues. The heat began to dissipate, but in compensation, a strange numbness took over my body. I moved my hands, but it seemed like they weren't mine. The sensation was surreal, like a confused dream or deep intoxication. You perceive what's happening around you, but have no control. When I looked at my body stretched out on the bed, I believed I was hallucinating. I tried to kneel to pray, but I couldn't. My bones cracked loudly, and my muscles seemed to writhe beneath my skin. There was no pain, but there was also no control. Suddenly, I realized I had fallen to the floor, looking up at the ceiling. That's when an unbearable smell filled the room. The same putrid odor of the creature that had attacked me days before. I was terrified, thinking it had come after me to finish what it started. Then the truth hit me like a punch. I was the creature. The transformation completed in a few minutes. I looked at myself in horror, unable to believe it. My mind was conscious, but my body was no longer mine. I felt everything, but it was as if I were trapped inside another entity. It was like a nightmare where you know you're inside the monster, but aren't the one giving the orders. An overwhelming feeling of sadness and repulsion took hold of me. I wanted to disappear. Without making a sound, the thing, or rather, I leaped through the open window with inhuman agility, jumped over the wall and ran through the streets, swift and stealthy. It was like being a passenger in my own body, forced to watch everything without being able to intervene. The creature avoided busy places, passing through deserted streets, abandoned lots, and wooded areas. I knew where it was going, as if my consciousness and intelligence were merging with its instincts. It was me, but it wasn't. Transforming is like being consumed by such intense rage that you lose control. You still know what's happening, but you're incapable of controlling yourself because of the primal needs that take over. Explanatory note: the basic needs of this condition include constant movement, feeding, and hunting. Interestingly, human and pig meat are not well accepted, often being vomited up. Attacks on humans generally occur due to extreme hunger, sexual frustration, or in some cases, simple mischief. The smell of human fear is almost addictive, something that provokes a particular state of euphoria. Most of the time, we don't have the desire to devour people. What we really seek is the smell of fear, of panic. For this, we do everything to provoke it. As skilled hunters, we can be completely silent and go unnoticed if we so choose. When we opt for noises and heavy footsteps, it's always intentional. The odor we exhale only serves to keep the curious away. However, if someone gets too close or physical contact occurs, we lose control and attack with impressive speed. I returned to where it all began, the dirt trail where I was attacked. I knew exactly what I wanted, the dogs. The first thing I did was sniff the air to make sure no other werewolf was around. I realized we're territorial. Where there's one, another doesn't establish itself. With the area clear, I easily jumped the wall. Knowing I was going to kill the dogs that had attacked me brought a strange feeling of satisfaction. I knelt, advanced without making a noise, slinking between the shadows. All the dogs were together. I stood up, observed, and in a few movements killed them. In this form, killing dogs is frighteningly easy. The yelps and commotion of the goats woke up Mr. Harmon. He came out of the house, already firing in all directions. I hid in the tall grass, lying down behind the corral without making a sound. From a distance, I heard his wife scream, "Carl." The beast killed the dogs. Harmon got to within about 15 feet of where I was. I stood up and released that terrible odor. The response was instantaneous. The smell of fear exhaled by him was almost intoxicating. He ran. Chasing someone overcome with terror is indescribable, almost pleasurable. I followed just to feel this up close, but he, desperate, turned the revolver backward. Before he could fire, I bit his forearm and plunged into the woods. An overwhelming fatigue took over me, and I simply blacked out. My grandmother woke me hours later, throwing a pair of shorts and a shirt over me. I don't want to know anything. It's better that way. I got up and entered the house without saying a word, but something caught my attention. The abrasions had disappeared, and the stitches were dry, almost ready to fall out. Explanatory note: sunlight burns the werewolf's fur, making it fall off and disintegrate like ashes. At the same time, the light restructures the body, making it return to normal. When there's no access to sunlight, even indirect, the reverse transformation process is slower. I was worried about Mr. Harmon, thinking he might transform into something like me. In the following days, I observed him from a distance. To my surprise, nothing happened to him. He remained well, despite carrying a slight limp that I never understood. To this day, he has an issue with me, but his health remains good. Explanatory note: a simple bite is not enough to transmit the condition. The victim must face the attack, resist, and survive. This merit is what determines if the transformation will be passed on. Fleeing or succumbing to fear prevents this from happening. My grandmother passed away in 2017 of natural causes at 93. My mother lost her battle with cancer in 2019 at 54. My father, now 66, is in good health and continues living in the same house. As for the werewolf who attacked me, I had the impression when I was in Morgantown 2 years ago that she still lives around there. She's a woman the same age as my father. Of course, I won't introduce them. It would be too strange to explain to my father that his stepmother once left me covered in scratches and bites in the woods. He's past the age for that kind of adventure. That was the story of my first experience with the supernatural, and what an experience. Although others have occurred over time, none compares to the first, which is the most memorable. To conclude, I'll leave you with a curious detail as a bonus. The transformations are not as involuntary as movies make them seem, at least not after the first few. They're also not limited to full moon nights. They occur at specific times of the year, coincidentally during the solstices and equinoxes, regardless of the moon phase. And yes, it's possible to resist the transformation. Perhaps that's why werewolves aren't common in urban areas. Transforming in densely populated places isn't exactly the smartest idea. As for the rest, well, that remains a secret. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.